The components that make up a SCOM infrastructure are numerous, as well as atomic in terms of the services that they provide towards the total mission. Let's take a minute here and talk about what these different components are and how they interrelate. We have obviously a management server, which more or less sits at the center of everything. Your management server is what attaches to your database. It's actually what sends information to that database and retrieves information from the database. When you're working with your agents or you're working with other different components to manage your SCOM infrastructure, those operations consoles will typically run their information through that management server. So you have this single connection between server and database. That management server can sit alone, or it can sit with other management servers inside of a management group should you have need to spread out the load in a very large infrastructure or to create a sense of high availability for its services itself. But it works with some other components that aren't necessarily always on the management server to accomplish certain tasks. One such component is the reporting server, which is used only whenever you're generating reports there inside of the operations console. The reporting server, curiously, can only be installed onto a SQL server where SSRS, SQL Reporting Services, has been installed. It is these Ops Manager reporting server components that sits on top of a SQL reporting server that allows it to offload all the extra effort involved with actually generating those reports. Sometimes the generation of reports can actually require a lot of resources for it to complete the task. And so moving this off onto a separate machine is often a good idea if you find yourself doing a lot of reports and that having an impact on the other activities of your management server. You can put your reporting server on the management server in a single server configuration. But again, in many situations, you find yourself creating separate services for allowing those activities to occur somewhere else. In addition to this reporting server, we also have a web console server, which commonly is co-located there with your management server, although it doesn't necessarily have to be. Your web console server is exactly that. It's a web server running web services. For those users who shouldn't have access to the full operations management console, well, you can give them web-based access to view just a limited subset of the different views that exist there. And that actually greatly reduces your administration and having to distribute out all the different operations management consoles that are out there and gives them a very constrained experience. Again, if you have people that don't need to perform many actions, doing so via the web console server and its services is really a great idea. These three different servers, but primarily the management server, will work with two different databases that exist there on your SQL server. The first is your operational database, and the second is your data warehouse database. As you'll learn, there's a lot of content, there's a lot of data that needs to be stored and can be fairly hot in terms of its level of change. If you think about all the different monitors that can exist that are associated to a server and its services, making sure all those monitors are in the right states at every point in time means that there's probably a lot of work going on in that operational database. The biggest difference is that your data warehouse database contains the historical information that you need to pull up from periods in the past. And there is an internal process that manages transferring information from your operational database then over to your data warehouse database where it's stored for longer-term archival. Your operational database will not tend to expand in size as much, obviously, as your data warehouse database. And there are some configurations there to groom those databases to ensure that you don't end up having too much content in the everyday operational database that you might not necessarily need. These components here aggregate to create what we think of as the management group, which can be a single server management group or a distributed management group if I'm using multiple servers. But anytime you're thinking about the management group as a construct, you really consider it, again, as the consolidation of all these different components and databases in a single location. It's worth mentioning that it is possible for you to create multiple different management groups, that they themselves have different sets of servers. It is possible also then to link those management groups together if you need to. So you can, if you have different geographic locations or different groups of people that should have distributed access, you can create multiple management groups and then roll up all the data through management group linkages to ultimately create a single pane of glass that contains all the monitoring information across your multiple different geographic locations. With this information now, let's then focus on the individual servers here and talk a bit about just some of their characteristics. For our management server here, it hosts those servers for administering the management group and also for communicating with the database. The operations console connects to that management server for that management group. And again, it's worth mentioning that the console then does not really have direct access to the data itself there inside of that database. It goes right through that management server. Your management groups can contain one or multiple management servers. We talked about this already. And when you're setting up agents, we'll talk about this later on as we get into the deployment of agents, but your agents typically at first are configured to a specific management server, but they can use any of the servers that exist if that server is down. So those management servers will share the load. Also, multiple management servers in a group will create what we term a resource pool with the goal of spreading the work across those pool members. This is a process that happens more or less automatically in the background. This is done so that surviving management servers can pick up the workload of a failed resource pool member. If you need to reboot a management server to apply a patch or for some reason it goes down, the surviving management servers will just simply pick up the load and continue to service those clients. Anytime you add in a new management server, the existing work will be automatically reallocated from existing resource pool members to include the resources that exist there on that management server. And all resource pool members manage a distinct set of remote objects. This is actually quite cool. The reason for this is that no two members of the same pool end up managing the same object at the same time. This will make more sense as we start digging into what the objects are. But even though there are multiple management servers in a resource pool, a management server always manages a single object, and it's not actually being managed in multiple locations at once. In addition to our management server, we also have our reporting server here. The job of the reporting server is to construct and present reports from data inside that data warehousing database. So it tends to focus its attentions again on the historical, the archival data from that in the past. As I mentioned, it must be installed on top of an instance of SQL Server SSRS, which, at least as of today, SSRS needs to be installed in a non-server core installation. So if you are planning on installing this onto server core, the reporting server, because of that SSRS limitation, will be one of the servers here that can't be installed onto a server core. It has to be on a full desktop version. That may evolve in the future if SSRS is updated to include support for server core. But at least as of this point, you will have to have it on a full desktop version. And as I said, it's generally separated in order to isolate those resource requirements anytime you're generating reports. Those reports, based off of how much data that you have, particularly in the case of audit collection services, those reports can take a long time to generate and require lots of CPU and memory resources to complete. Also here with our web console server, as I mentioned, this hosts that web-based console for any users who won't want to use the SCOM management console itself. It does, though, provide access only to the monitoring and My Workspace views there inside of the console. And so the idea is that you configure a constrained experience for those users that are only logging into the web console server so that they can see just a couple of views that exist there in those two monitoring and My Workspace views. Older versions of the web console server actually ran on Silverlight, although Microsoft's, stepping away from Silverlight for a lot of these tools means that it no longer does in this version. There is one area where Silverlight still is required, and that is for displaying dashboard views. Those dashboard views, as you'll come to find out, have some nice widgets involved that Silverlight makes much easier to display. And so if you do have those, you will still need Silverlight there at the client. Out of all of these, it's most important to recognize that access to the data there inside of the web console has the same restrictions as whatever you've configured there in the operations console. So there's not going to be any separate user role assignment here for the web console server. Whatever data you've configured for a user or a group of users there in the console will be the data that they can then access there in that web console server, limited again to that monitoring and My Workspace views. These three servers then attach to our two databases, the first of which is that operational database, which contains all the operational data. Most of this is the configuration information, the monitoring rules, and all the things that you're setting up to be monitored there for your management group. We will talk about monitors and rules and how all those then are represented inside of the console as we get into the next course. But recognize that that information there is stored inside of the operational database. That database generally should, if you're worried about this being a Tier 1 service, be made highly available using a supported clustering configuration. I'll talk about that here in just a second. But again, that is kind of an optional configuration if this does end up being a highly critical service there in your environment. And generally, you do want to keep this operational database, I think I mentioned this, at a consistent size by configuring your grooming settings to specify the length of data retention. I believe by default that the last 7 days of data are stored there in that operational database, although that can be adjusted to whatever you see fit. More data obviously will make the database bigger and then also more costly in terms of locating information in that database. So using your grooming settings there, and that's something we'll talk about here in just a minute, that can actually keep the contents, the size of that database, to something that's manageable. The data that doesn't exist there in that operational database, when it actually ages out of the operational database, ends up in your data warehouse database, which is an entirely separate database, which sometimes is on a different SQL server that is collected and stored for long-term reporting. Your data there is written directly using rules and data synchronization processes that exist there in the operational database. So you will write rules, or you will use the rules that already exist there to synchronize and offload that data from operational to data warehouse. Your aggregation, your grooming, your optimization, maintenance, all of these are performed automatically by Operations Manager. There's nothing you need to do from a manual sense to get that data moved from one database to the other. But the great thing is that a data warehouse database can be used to archive information across multiple different management groups at the same time. And this is actually great if you have a distributed organization with different users and different admins in different geographic locations. The idea here is that whereas the operational database may be useful for the everyday troubleshooting and monitoring of service behaviors, it may be useful for you to consolidate all the data across all of your sites into a single location for that later reporting, so you have all the data in one single location. As with the operational database, you can cluster it for high availability, or if you don't feel like clustering it, again, this is a very large archival database, you can also, and I believe this is a quote from TechNet, just carefully monitor it for issues. Obviously, this is an Operations Manager infrastructure, and so the careful monitoring of databases is something that comes with the package. All of these here identify the required components for a management group, but there is one additional component that you can bring to bear when you have those special use cases for clients that exist outside your Active Directory domain or on the other side of a particularly tightly controlled firewall. The gateway server is a specialized management server designed to consolidate agent connections from computers in untrusted domains, and also when firewalls separate agents from management servers. This gateway server is when you want to consolidate those agents that need to attach to a management server when they are somewhere else out in the network, perhaps in a DMZ, perhaps up in Azure, perhaps connected to some other domain that exists there in your environment. The idea is that the gateway server resides in the untrusted domain. So if you have a second domain, maybe a partner domain where you need to perform monitoring, that gateway server becomes a member of that untrusted domain and then uses a certificate authentication to pass its traffic backwards to your management server back here in your domain. This gives you the abilities to then consolidate all the connections for those clients in that remote location and then pass them through a single connection from your gateway server through into your internal management server. Now, that said, your gateway server is not typically used for managing the bandwidth utilization for those agents. Some previous versions and also some earlier guidance suggested the use of a gateway server to consolidate those connections for the purposes of reducing the throughput requirements between those clients and a management server. It actually does not really reduce the total amount of data that needs to be transferred. It's really just about managing the agent certificates on each agent that would otherwise be required. If you did not have a gateway server in that remote domain or in that remote location, each individual agent would require its own certificate and its own communication path through the firewall in order to transfer that information from the agent and all the way to your internal management server. And if you're like me, passing out a bunch of certificates to each individual agent and punching holes through the firewall for each of those agents to connect, you probably don't think this is a great idea. And so consolidating them down to a single externally accessible gateway server really makes things a lot easier for management over time. Now, just one more slide here in relation to the different components. I do want to talk about the operational database and the data warehouse database. I mentioned that when we're talking about HA, the management server HA is handled through an operations manager process. So you just simply install a second management server and those two servers then communicate with each other. But in order to facilitate high availability for your database, you'll need to use some SQL Server process to accomplish the task. This can be one of two options. Number one, Windows failover clustering, so creating a clustered database, or then using SQL always-on databases. Obviously, Microsoft recommends always-on databases because they are always on. Windows failover clustering databases can incur short periods of downtime when you do end up failing over that database from one node to the other. But these are the two supported functionalities that exist there. In the case of disaster recovery, I have also seen, although not on Microsoft's website, I have also seen the use of things like Hyper-V Replica as a solution for disaster recovery. But again, that's not displayed here because mostly that was found on other websites not associated with Microsoft.com. So again, these are the solutions that exist for adding HA to these two databases. They're right natively inside of SQL Server itself. This infrastructure that we're about to lay into place. In order to do that, I'd like to bring up a page here from Microsoft's website. This web page here is from docs.microsoft.com, titled Planning a Management Group Design. It is here on this documentation page where we can find just a couple of different images that do a really good job of showing all these different pieces and how they get consolidated together into both the single server management group as well as the distributed management server group configuration. Let me come down here and show you the first of these two images, which is the single server management group configuration. You can see right there in the center the management server on which we have not only the management server components, but also the databases and the database server. So our operational database, our data warehouse database, our ACS and reporting databases are also located on that single machine. If you have yourself a very small environment, and I do mean a very small environment, and one that has really no need for high availability, this single server configuration could potentially fulfill your requirements. What you will find yourself running up against most in this single server configuration is just simply running out of resources. One of the reasons why we distribute out all these different servers and services onto different machines is that each actually can be fairly useful, consumptive of available resources like CPU and memory. And so while you're attempting to, for example, run a report, while you're receiving agent data, while you're working there in the operations management console, in a single server configuration, many times you'll find yourself not really running with very good performance. And so splitting these out into what is down here, the distributed server model, I recognize this is a bit small there on the screen, but mainly I just want to show you here that splitting it out actually helps split out the load and the consumption of those resources, while also adding the potential for high availability. You can see here that we now have the distribution of our management server into two management servers and the splitting off of that gateway server into its own machine. And then we also have a resource pool down here of some other management servers that connect up to our SQL databases right up here that they themselves are attached to from an SSRS instance. We also have a web console server out here that's been split off as well. So again, there's really not anything terribly interesting to see here. It's all fairly obvious in terms of how we're splitting these up. But mainly I just wanted to show you that this page here in Microsoft's website does a very good job of giving you an idea of how to plan then that distributed management group as you start rolling this into production. I do want to talk a bit about the order of component installation with the caveat that this is by no means the required order. This order is in fact just the generally accepted order when you're first building a new SCOM infrastructure. You can, if you incorporate these different components in different orders, perhaps over time, do so in different orders, not necessarily following this. But if you are planning on implementing an entire infrastructure out of whole cloth, this is the generally established right way to do it, I guess I'll say. First up, obviously, is the installation of your first management server. This will be onto our machine MGMT, which will be doing so in the module coming up. From there, you typically then install your additional management servers next. These obviously will require your SQL Server infrastructure to be in place. And if you are doing SQL clustering, you usually want to have your SQL cluster in place as well before you ever start doing any management server installations. Once those management servers are installed, coming up next is your reporting server, which again goes onto that server where you've installed SQL Server reporting services. Reporting server will require the management servers to be up and operational to complete the connection there. If you are doing any gateway servers, those can be installed there next, or really at any point after you've gone through the initial installation of your management servers and your reporting server. But once you've done that, the installation and then configuration of ACS, Audit Collection Services, is something that's typically done next. I think actually we're going to do this a bit out of order, so this gives you an idea of how these aren't necessarily hard and fast rules. One reason is that the next item here, the installation of your SCOM agents onto various machines, is a process that can be just slightly easier if you already have the Audit Collection Services components in place. But as you can see here, there is the order, and then there is the way that we're about to do that here in this in the module coming up. Once you've got the agents then deployed, you can then install your ACS forwarders, which is a topic we'll talk about when we get into ACS. And then lastly, once everything's then installed and you've got a clean bill of health there for the agents talking then to your servers, the last bit is to go through installing your management packs. We have not yet talked about these management packs and what they bring to the environment, but for now you can think of them as the collection of knowledge, the information about what you want to monitor for specific services and servers. You will install management packs for the different kinds of services that exist in your environment, and once they are installed, they start adding in rules and monitors automatically into the environment to increase the scope of what actually is monitored on each installed and configured agent. Very quickly here for capture, I also want to talk about the security accounts that you'll want to have in place before we start any installation here of our first management server. There are actually more security accounts that can be later configured as you enable further services. But just to get yourself started so you can install that first management server, we have a couple of them that we want to get up and operational because they'll be required as we go through those installations. The first is our Ops Manager Server Action account. As it states, there are some actions that your Ops Manager server will need to perform then, potentially on clients or also on itself. And so there is an Active Directory account then that's required in order to contain those privileges for accomplishing those tasks. We also have a configuration and data access account that we can use. I have here OMAA and OMDAS, but you could call these anything you want. I've just got these here as they're common for setting up these service accounts in a lot of environments. In addition to that, for your data warehouse configuration, so actually enabling read and write access to the data warehouse, we have two accounts there, OM-read and OM-write. Separating those out so that we have one account that can read data and one account that has the privileges to write data. We also have our SQL Service account here, which again can be anything you want, but that's the account we'll use for running SQL Server and for making all the changes there to your operational database and also getting the databases set up. All of these accounts here then need to be added to a global group called OM admin. There inside of your domain, company.pri, create a global group, call it OM admins if you want, and then add in those four accounts, OMAA, OMDAS, OMRead, and OMWrite to that global group. Notice here that the SQL Server account is not added to the group. Also add yourself, your user account, and the user account of any member of your operations team that should have access then to work with the Operations Manager console. Once you've done that, then add that group to the local administrators group on any of your management servers, or really any servers that you're working with here in the infrastructure. It is that group which will have the permissions then to go about installing all the necessary components as we get further along here in this course. So those should be the accounts, the security accounts that are required. These are just basic Active Directory accounts with no further configuration required, but these are what will be necessary as we get into the installation here coming up. You know, I hate death by PowerPoint just like the next good IT administrator, but sometimes it's important for helping us level set for what's necessary as we get into the demonstration. What have we talked about in this module? We've gone through a long series of slides here to talk about things like the SCOM infrastructure and the design aspects of building that first management group. We looked also at just some of the architectures there, again, cheating off of Microsoft's website, taking a look at some of the photos that exist, and then explored the order of installation, the suggested but maybe not necessarily required order of installation, and also prepared those security accounts so that we can go through that install in our module coming up. In fact, coming up next, we have our first module of actual demonstration here on installing and configuring our first management server. In the next module, we'll go through the actual install of the components there to make up our management server. And once installed, we'll spend just a minute taking a look at its admin console to get some of the initial configurations out of the way. That conversation on the installation and configuration of our first management server is the topic for our next module coming up. Our first order of business is the installation and initial configuration of our management server. That is the core of our operations management infrastructure that we're building here. And obviously, as with really any Microsoft installation, there will be some prerequisite other stuff that needs to be installed. Curiously though, as we go through that confirmation, just making sure that our SQL configuration is correct, and then also the installation of those prerequisites, there are some there that are not immediately obvious in terms of where you need to look on Microsoft's website to actually find what you need to download. So I'll walk you through just making sure indeed that you do have the right SQL configuration and also what those installation prerequisites will be. From there, we'll go through the installation of our management server. At the same time, we'll go through also installing our web console, also onto that same machine MGMT. We can accomplish both of those during that same installation routine, so we'll do them both at the same time here. We will then go through the installation of our operations console, really the least exciting part of this install, there onto our machine My Desktop, so our management workstation there. And then lastly, go through the configuration of the management group, just some initial configurations that will be necessary as we then prepare this Ops Manager infrastructure for then adding clients and turning on all this monitoring. One of the most important things you should know here at this point is that once you complete this installation of your management server, it is usually a good idea to allow it to just kind of sit and do its processes for at least about an hour after all the usual next finished has been completed. There are some background processes that need to occur that can take up to an hour or more even after the install completes for Ops Manager to really complete what it needs to do. And so before you go through any further configuration beyond what we'll be talking about here, or particularly if you go through the updating through further update releases, you'll want to wait around at least about an hour or so before you go through any further installations. Let us begin this process by confirming our SQL configuration here on our machine sql.company.pri. I have actually a couple of things I want to show you here. Number one is exactly which components need to be installed onto your SQL server, which I'll take a look at here by choosing to add features to an existing installation. We're not actually going to add any features here, but we are going to take a look at which ones I've already configured here onto this machine. As we go through then the setup right here, I want to take you down to the existing instance of SQL right here to just show you that on this machine, we need to have both database engine services right here, as well as reporting services installed onto this computer, and also full text and semantic extractions right over here for search. If you have these three items installed onto your computer, you would have everything really configured so far for what we need in installing this management server. One further configuration that you might want to do while you're here is in making sure that your SQL accounts have been reconfigured to point to those Active Directory domain accounts that we talked about back on that last module. Let me come down here and show you here under SQL Server 2016 and then the SQL Server 2016 Configuration Manager right here. You can see that I've already made those changes for at least for two of the three that we need to take a look at. The first one here, if I show you right here, is our SQL Server agent right here, and then also our SQL Server, so the actual server itself. Both of these have been reconfigured to company/SQL SVC and set up so that they're running. And in fact, I do need to make sure that this one's running as well. Both of these will need to be running for us to continue with this installation later on. You will also, as we get into the further configuration of reporting services, later on here in this course, as we go through the installation of Ops Manager reporting server, you'll also want to make sure that this gets reconfigured here to that SQL Service account. And if you want to separate them out, you can. We've got them all here under a single account. That's really up to you in terms of how you want to split these up. But these are the three that need to be configured here, or probably should be configured here to that Active Directory account. That's about what's necessary here on our SQL server. We do have some prerequisite installations that are required over here. If I flip to our management server, this is management or mgmt.company.pri. This is the machine on which, here in a second, we'll go through the installation of that Ops Manager management server. But I do want to show you that there are a couple of prerequisites that are necessary before we ever go through running the setup file right down here. These are Report Viewer 2015, and then also this SQL System CLR types right down here. Let me actually bring up just the location where you can find these because they're not immediately obvious as you start clicking around there in Microsoft's website. Let me show you those sites. If I come down here to Internet Explorer, the site we're looking for is the one you see right up here. This is ID 45496, which will take you to Microsoft's website here for the Microsoft Report Viewer 2015 runtime. And actually, this is kind of a strange installation because this report viewer, an earlier version, at least on Windows 10, is already available on your machines. But here in Windows Server 2016, you will need to complete this install. And the install requires a further prerequisite install, like what you can see here. That is the Microsoft System CLR types for SQL Server 2014. That download is one that you can find actually right over here. Let me bring back up Internet Explorer once again and take you to ID 42295 right here, which will point you to the Microsoft SQL Server 2014 feature pack. And this is actually a collection of a large number of additional components that can be installed and used with SQL Server. There are further install instructions down here that talk a bit about each of the individual components. What we're looking for is the Microsoft CLR types for SQL Server 2014, which is somewhere down here at the bottom. What I do want to show you is that where you'll find it here, as you click on the download page, is in this very long list of all the items that exist. First, search for the x64 version, and then right down here is what you're looking for right here, the SQL SYS CLR types.msi. I've already downloaded these here. In fact, both of these downloads already exist locally here for installing those system CLR types and for Report Viewer. So let me get those installed here right now. And fast forwarding things to the other end of those installs, there really is nothing more than a next finish there to complete both of these installs. You can see that we've completed now Report Viewer and obviously also the SQL System CLR types as well. So we have all these necessary prerequisites already here on this machine. We do have a couple of further ones that are going to be necessary because we will be installing the web console onto this machine. One such configuration requires the use of that certificate that we already enrolled for back earlier on in this course. That certificate, if you remember, is down here in our computer view, and there under Personal, under Certificates, you can see the certificate that's associated to mgmt.company.pri. I will need to use this certificate to bind HTTPS there in IIS so I can make use of it for that web console we're about to install. Let me come back over here and then bring up Server Manager and then open up here IIS Manager to make use of that existing certificate. That existing certificate we can find right down here under the default website right here. Once we have our default website, we can edit the bindings here and then add in a new binding for HTTPS that now corresponds to that certificate that we've configured here. You can see under View that if we've done everything correctly, the certification path for this certificate should go all the way up to our trusted root there on our domain controller. So this should be a good certificate that we can use here for HTTPS. Now obviously for IIS to exist on this machine, we needed to have installed IIS. And let me actually show you one way in which you can quickly get the necessary components for IIS installed onto this computer. Let me minimize this, and rather than actually show you here inside of Server Manager, let me use PowerShell to rather show you one very quick PowerShell script that you can run to install just the required components of IIS here onto this machine. Let me show you right here exactly the use of this script, and let me make it just a bit bigger here so you can see it. Right over here is the Add Windows Feature command that adds in just the necessary components of IIS that will be required by our management server, specifically the web console that we'll be configuring here in just a second. One very important note here is that although the installation of this IIS component, all these different role services, does not necessarily require a restart, you will want to make sure that you restart this server after the IIS installation is complete. It's just a necessary requirement so you don't end up with some error messages as we get further along. So you will want to make sure that you get IIS installed on here, again, for that web console component that we'll be installing here in just a second. It exists right here. I've already downloaded and unpacked, obviously, the Ops Manager 2016 ISO file right down here into a remote location. And so once I've unpacked it here, this setup.exe file will make available then the Ops Manager installation wizard like what you can see here. When we go through that installation, there may be some updates here to the setup program, so we will want to download any latest updates to make sure that we have the latest setup updates to get all these pieces installed correctly. Let me now go through the installation for Ops Manager here onto this computer by launching the setup wizard here. This will go through installing and unpacking some prerequisite components and then present me with the screen like what you see here. This allows me to install up to 4 different components onto this machine. So our management server, our operations console, our web console, and then our reporting server. The only two that we're interested in right here are our web console and then our management server. So these two that we'll install onto this computer. The operations console we'll install later onto our Windows 10 machine. Let me choose next here to then install it to the location, the default location here in C program files, and then allow it to take a look at the hardware and software to validate that indeed we do have all the necessary prerequisites in place. You can see here that indeed we do, so we can now continue with the setup. From this point, we have quite a few configurations that we need to make. The first of which will be determining if this is the first management server or a subsequent management server in an existing group. Obviously, the only difference between doing it the first time and the second time is that the second time you will have done most of the pre-configuration already. And so later on, as you go into production, you will need to, for your second server, go through the second radio button down here on the bottom to add that second management server in. We here, however, will be creating the first management server, and we'll need to identify what a management group name will be. You usually want to keep these fairly simple. You may not necessarily want to put, for example, Ops Manager 2016 in the name, because this may evolve over time. For me, I tend to name these based off of the geographic location where these management groups exist. You may have different requirements, obviously, but for me, I'll actually make this the DEN management group because I happen to be in Denver today. For our Denver management group here, we will name it and choose Next, and then read and agree to the license terms, and continue here with some of the further configurations. We now need to identify where our operational database is located, which will be assigned to a specific server name and an instance name if we've configured up a specific SQL instance on that server. I am using the default instance over on that machine, so the only thing we have to put here is our server name, SQL. The traditional SQL Server port is right here, 1433. This is the Operations Manager database that we will be creating, and typically you want to leave the database size here to its current configuration as 1,000 megabytes. You can adjust this to something else later on, and in fact we'll talk about that here later on in this module, but for now let's just set this to its original and default size of 1,000 megabytes. These are the two locations where that database will be created, the actual data for the database itself. Remember that this is the smaller of the two databases, your operations database as opposed to the archival database, which can actually get quite large. If I choose Next here, that allows me to now configure the data warehouse database. So this is the larger of those two databases. Once again, I'll punch in SQL as a server name, and if I tab away here, this will allow me to create that data warehousing database with, again, the same default size, at least to start. Remember that before you even get to this point, it's usually a good idea to have a feeling for how much data you plan on storing in that data warehousing database. If you have needs for a very large amount of data over a very long period of time, well, the database itself and the server hosting that database will need to be sized to support the amount of data that you're going to store. Here in just a minute, we'll go through those retention settings that you can configure on that data warehousing database to at least keep control of how big this database can become. Again, for now, we'll leave this to 1,000 megabytes as its initial size as the database gets created. I'll choose Next here to take us to the next screen or next page of the wizard, where we're now configuring our web console and the web console settings. Here we have our default website, which is really the only website that exists here on this really default installation of IIS. The big configuration here is whether or not you want to enable SSL on this machine. If you have that certificate already pre-positioned, which you should, that certificate can be used to then enable SSL there on the default website. So we will configure this to enable SSL. Be aware that we're not yet installing the reporting component. We'll take care of that a little bit later on. I'll choose Next down here to go to the next page of the wizard where we can identify which authentication mode we'll use with the web console. For our configuration, we'll use mixed authentication, which is what's used most commonly in your traditional intranet scenario. So your users will have to, as it says here, provide their username and password or use their current Windows credentials to access that web console. Later on, as we get into users and groups, that is where we'll identify which users and groups will have access to the web console. I'll choose Next here to go to the next page in the wizard, where we'll need to identify those Operations Manager accounts. If you remember earlier when we went through all the different accounts that it's usually a good idea to pre-create there in Active Directory, it's exactly this wizard page here, which is why we created them before we got to this step. Those were our Management Server Action account, our Configuration Service and Data Access Service account, which in our case will be a domain account, our Data Reader account, and also our Data Writer account. Let me go through and actually punch in the domain, username, and password for all four of these accounts. And so fast forwarding things to the other end of me typing all this in, you can see these four accounts have been entered in here. It is entirely possible for you to use the same account for all four of these, although separating them out will become evident as we get further on into understanding why we have these different accounts. Let me choose Next here to use these four as what we'll be using for our Operations Manager accounts, which takes us to the next page here, which is your typical boilerplate page talking about the use of diagnostic and usage data that gets sent up to Microsoft. That configuration is something that we don't actually do here. It can be reconfigured later on as we get the Operations Manager console in place. So we'll click Next here and then Install to go through the installation here of our Ops Manager server. This process obviously takes a pretty extended period of time. So as before, I'll go through and pause things, and when we get back, we'll have a completed installation here of our management server. Now, very quickly, as we're going through the installation there of our management server, again, that takes a pretty extended period of time. Let's now go through the install of our operations console. As I mentioned, this is probably the least exciting of all the configurations we need to accomplish. This Ops Manager console also requires that Microsoft Report Viewer 2015 runtime, which I've already gone through the install here onto this machine. And when I go through the setup routine here, this is the exact same setup routine that we were seeing before over on the server side, except this time instead of installing the management server and the web console, we will exclusively be installing the operations console here onto this machine. The process, as you can see, is relatively unexciting. I just need to choose the operations console right here, choose next, choose the location where that console will be installed, go through the same verification there of hardware and software, choose next, agree to the license terms, the diagnostic and usage data screens here, and then complete the installation. So again, not terribly interesting here, but this is the steps you would go through in order to get that console then installed on each machine where you'll have a user who will require full console access to Operations Manager. With now our Ops Manager console installed, as well as our management server, we can now go through the initial configuration of this Ops Manager server. You can see here that the setup is complete, and actually if I flip back over here to our MGMT server, the management server installation is complete as well. You can see here that it actually installed an evaluation version of Ops Manager during this initial run through. And for us to be able to convert this to an actual production instance, we're going to have to change the license here. Let's begin that process by actually doing the license replacement here back on our machine My Desktop. Let me close down everything here because we have no need to take a look at any of these setup screens anymore. The way in which you change the license around for your Ops Manager server requires the use of Windows PowerShell. And I won't obviously be showing you what my license key is here, but let me show you exactly which PowerShell command you need to use in order to make that license change. Let me first switch over here to that other server. That would be our MGMT server with enter ps session MGMT. Once I've logged in, the command I'm interested in is set SCOM license, and then with the product ID, then equal to the license that I want to enter in. That'll be a 25 character string. So what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way through 25 characters to enter in that new license. So this is the process you'll need to go through there on the host itself, on that management server to update the license. We do have some further configurations as well that need to be done there inside of the operations console itself. And in fact, this is the first time we're going to get a chance to actually use this operations console. Right here with the Ops Manager console here, we're going to connect it up here to our existing infrastructure on MGMT. As you can see here, we've got a series of panes that we'll be working through throughout the rest of this course and the courses to come that will talk about the monitoring of each individual component, the authoring of those monitors that we'll be talking about later on, and then for our purposes here, the administration tab right down here. We'll be working with this administration tab throughout the rest of this course to get everything set up in preparation for actually monitoring the clients that we want to take a look at. We start our process all the way down at the bottom with our settings view right down here, where we have some master settings for the Ops Manager infrastructure that we're building. Let's step through the ones of these that are important for our use here at this point. The first of which is our heartbeat settings here, which determine how many seconds each agent will attempt to then reach out to our Ops Manager server to let it know that it is still functioning properly. You tend not to adjust this all that often because obviously if you reduce that heartbeat interval, there's just that much more contact that each individual agent's going to have with the SCOM server here. So again, we tend to leave these essentially at 60 seconds unless you have a need to do so for some greater or lower reason. We can also configure our alerts here. These alerts allow us to set up different resolution states and IDs associated with those resolution states. As with the heartbeats, you tend not to find yourself adjusting these all that often unless you find yourself in need of a specific additional resolution state for the kinds of alerts that you'll be working with. A change here can have long-ranging effects in all the different monitors that you're configuring. And most of the monitors that are configured, at least from Microsoft, that you receive in a management pack, will be associated with these resolution states like what you can see here. So any custom resolution state will be something that you'll later on have to adjust in the monitors that you later configure. You can also configure here automatic alert resolution. So how long can an unresolved active alert stick around? Those that are in the new resolution state will be resolved automatically after 30 days, and all active alerts, when the source is healthy, will be resolved after 7 days. Again, I tend to start with these with the default configuration. If you find yourself with all manner of alerts there in the list that are just not being resolved, you're not having the time to resolve them, you may want to extend these by just a bit. But again, at least here initially, you may want to leave these to their default configuration until you get a feel for exactly how you're going to be interacting with your Ops Manager infrastructure. I will leave these to be the same here for now. I talked about database grooming. This is the first of the two locations where you can change some of your database grooming settings. These settings correspond to those records that exist in the operations database, not the data warehousing database. So by default, just about all the different types of records that exist there in the database will age out of that operational database and into the warehousing database after about 7 days. Your performance signatures will then age out after 2 days. Obviously, if you adjust these can have an impact on the overall size of that operations database, which then will have an impact on the performance of working with the database. So be able to take a look here at exactly how much data you really require for the usual kinds of troubleshooting activities you'll be doing when you're working with Ops Manager. As with the other configurations, at least at the beginning, I tend to wait for a while to determine exactly how I'm going to be interacting with this database and with my infrastructure before I go through making any modifications here to how long these records then exist in the operations database. So we'll leave these to be the same as well. We have some privacy settings here which determine what kinds of information then gets uploaded to Microsoft whenever we see error messages on servers or client machines. We can choose to or not to send data to Microsoft. We can choose what data then gets forwarded automatically or not at all to Microsoft. And we can also filter exactly what kinds of data is given to Microsoft whenever these errors occur. Every IT pro that I work with usually has one or the other approach as it relates to sending information to Microsoft. That, on one hand, it can be helpful to Microsoft for improving the product, or on the other hand, I don't want them having my information. So depending on which type of IT pro you are, you'll set these to very different configurations here. We also have down here our reporting settings, which determine our reporting server URL. Right now, we're going to leave this out because we haven't made that configuration to reporting server, but we'll later be making this configuration as we go through that installation. Here under web addresses is where we define what the address for our web console server will be. And by default, this is actually an incorrect configuration. As you can see here, we are first setting this up to https mgmt/operationsmanager. However, the certificate that we've applied there to that machine uses the fully qualified domain name for MGMT. So if we set this from mgmt to mgmt.company.pri, that will then give us the appropriate FQDM so that we can then connect to our Operations Manager instance there on the web console. If you want to make this change here, you can also test to validate that indeed you can make that connection. Here you can see I'll be punching in my username. In fact, let me not do that in uppercase. My username here and my password, and if I choose to remember the credentials here, I'll get a successful connection here to the web console. We won't be spending too much time with this web console throughout the course of this series because everything here is really just a subset of what exists in the operations console, but this does allow you to then very easily connect to it once you make this configuration change. So let me close out of here and choose OK to continue what we're doing here. I should mention that we also can later on make a configuration here for our online product knowledge. We'll talk more about the configuration of knowledge as we get later on in the course to come. Let me choose OK here and then come down to our heartbeat and security values right down here at the bottom. This configuration here determines the number of missed heartbeats that are allowed before we identify that this computer is experiencing a problem. Recall that the default configuration is 60 seconds, so a server can miss about 180 seconds worth of heartbeats before we identify that it indeed is experiencing an issue. So you may decide to adjust these if you want, although sometimes servers do miss heartbeats. So setting this down to a lower number can result in more false positives as you roll this into production. I tend to leave these here at 3 at least initially, so I'll leave these being the default settings here. Lastly is our security setting here, which really isn't so much about security, but rather client security or agent security. When we go about deploying agents in the module coming up, we actually have a couple different approaches that we can use for getting those agents then installed. One way is to push the agents from the server and have them automatically installed. Another way involves the manual installation of that agent on any machine. This security setting here allows you to either reject those manual agent installations or to put them in a pending management review state once they've been installed. What this does is it protects you from a user installing a management agent and then having it automatically start inserting its data into your Operations Manager infrastructure. Because any user with admin privileges could ostensibly download that agent from Microsoft's website, it's usually a good idea to reconfigure these to either reject or to review those manual agent installations as opposed to automatically then bringing that data and that agent into your infrastructure. I will make this configuration change here to review those agent installations, because later on in that next module, we'll go through some manual agent installations as we get them distributed out. If I hit OK here, that makes that configuration change. And really, these are the initial configurations that we need to just get our Operations Manager infrastructure up and operational. One final topic in this initial configuration of our Ops Manager infrastructure is the setting of retention settings for our data warehouse database. Be aware that although earlier we made some changes, or really take a look here at the database grooming settings, these have to do with how old data can exist in the operations database before it ages out into our data warehousing database. They have nothing really to do with how long data can then exist in that data warehousing database itself. In order to make those changes, there actually is no way to do so here inside of the graphical user interface. To make those changes, we actually have to use a little tool that you can download from Microsoft's website. This tool can be found right here on a web page in the Operations Manager team blog on the Data Warehouse Data Retention Policy Tool, or dwdatarp.exe. This is an ancient tool down here. It was written back in 2008, so that tells you a bit about any structural changes that may have happened over time to this data warehousing database. But if you come down here, right down here at the bottom, very tiny, is the zip file that contains this executable you can run. The executable actually just makes some changes directly there to your SQL tables, the actual database itself. So you could accomplish this by making those changes on your SQL database. Most of us don't like to actually do that to production databases, so this tool exists just to make things simpler for those of us that don't want to touch our production databases. Right down here, I've got an elevated command prompt that I brought up here for the desktop, and if I do dw data rp right here, you can see the list of commands and parameters that exist here for this command. We need to direct this to our SQL database and then also to the database name in order to really get an idea for what those initial retention settings are for the different types of data that exist there in the data warehousing database. So let us now clear the screen and let me show you just a couple of the ways in which you can use this command. If I do dwdatarp.exe and then point it to the SQL server, sql.company.pri, the database will be Operations Manager DW. And right here you can see the maximum age for the different kinds of data that exists here in this database. Microsoft has actually segmented out the database here to break it into hourly and daily aggregations of data to eliminate it from needing to be in a single table that just gets very large over time. You can see here that for our performance and our state data, we have a raw data value here that gets consolidated up into hourly aggregations, which they themselves then get consolidated up into daily aggregations. Obviously, performance data can be quite large, and so we're only capturing about 10 days of data here. That is the raw data coming right out of the database. It very quickly gets rolled up into hourly and daily aggregations because as time goes on, you tend not to require that granular a level of data as you get further and further into the future. For alert data, we really just do a raw data right here, total of 400 days of data. And client monitoring, we do raw data and then daily aggregations for that data. If you find, though, that a little more than a year is perhaps too much data for you, you can change these values by using the same dwdatarp command. Let me copy and paste here from my notes over here to the side, just one way in which we can do that. One command right here is dwdatarp, again against our SQL Server and our Operations Manager DW database. For this, we will do the performance data set, which is equivalent to right over here, and then our hourly aggregations. We can change that from 400 days to 180 days. If I make this change here, you can see that now we are only capturing up to 180 days of data in this data warehousing database before we start getting rid of old data that we probably don't need anymore. So you can make changes here if you find you're not going to need that level of data. This can greatly reduce the total size of that data warehousing database if you really don't need that data after all. While much of what we're doing here is indeed next finish to get that management server installed here for our Operations Manager infrastructure, there are some other tasks and prerequisites that are required. What have we talked about in this module? We've gone through making sure that our SQL Server is configured appropriately, and also that we have all the necessary prerequisites installed onto our management server and then onto the clients that will require that Operations Manager console. We went through then the install of our management server and the web console. We also installed the operations console, which wasn't all that exciting. and then went through some initial configuration there, really just the basic settings for our management group, focusing mostly on those retention values to make sure that we don't capture more data than really we want to store in that SQL database. Coming up next, we begin the integration of this Ops Manager infrastructure into the rest of our Windows environment. In that next module, we'll go through discovering the available resources, the other Windows servers that exist out there, and installing agents onto those machines. As I mentioned, there are a couple different ways in which agents can be installed, and we'll talk about all of them here in the module coming up. With agents then on those machines, we can begin the process of monitoring their performance, their activities, and their otherwise behaviors here in our Ops Manager infrastructure. That conversation on discovering resources and installing agents is a topic for our next module coming up. Our next task is where the fun begins. It's here where we finally get to begin integrating our Ops Manager infrastructure in with the rest of the resources, the Windows Server resources that exist out there in the rest of our data center. And you might think that a module here on discovering resources and installing agents might not actually have all that much content, but rather that process of getting agents deployed out throughout the rest of those resources does indeed require actually quite a bit of additional information. We here in this module will be talking about the different approaches that exist for installing those agents, including the process to not even install an agent in certain circumstances. There are really about 6 different ways in which you can get those agents deployed out to your different Windows servers, and I want to talk about which ones make more sense than which other ones. The easiest of these is one that involves just an automated solution right there in the operations console to discover those Windows Server resources and then deploy out an agent automatically. This works for most situations once you roll this into production, but maybe not all the situations that are out there. You can indeed install your SCOM agents manually, either by the traditional next finish, by installing it through Windows PowerShell, by using MSI exec, all the usual ways in which you can deploy out a SCOM agent, even including automated software deployment solutions like Group Policy or Configuration Manager. We'll talk about all of these, and most specifically here, I want to focus our attentions on the silent switches that MSI exec will require so that you can get the proper configuration on those agents once you deploy them out. Now, actually installing the agent is one thing, but pointing it back to your Ops Manager infrastructure is yet another. You can do that as part of the MSI exec series of silent switches, or you can configure that information there in Active Directory and have the agent just query Active Directory for which management server it should attach towards. We'll talk here about the not entirely obvious way in which you configure this Active Directory integration. At first blush, right there in the operations console, you might think that it's just a couple of buttons you need to click in order to turn on this Active Directory integration. But the reality is that there is some additional command line work that's required behind the scenes for this Active Directory integration to really be configured appropriately. Each agent has the abilities to then bring information back into our Ops Manager infrastructure, and if you turn on this other configuration here called Agent Proxy, the agent itself can be used as a proxy for your Ops Manager infrastructure to discover further resources. Now, if you dig around inside the properties of each agent, you'll find that the agent proxy enabling it is actually considered to be kind of a security concern. That said, however, these days, many management packs actually require the enabling of agent proxy so that the agent can discover further resources on behalf of the Ops Manager infrastructure. And so although there is that warning there in the interface, it actually is a good idea for you to turn on agent proxy for all those agents that you deploy out. So much so that there is a way in which you can change the default behavior for enabling agent proxy with a couple of command line tools, really using Windows PowerShell here. So I'll show you how you turn it on, and then I'll show you how you turn it on by default as well. There is also the abilities to pre-install that SCOM agent onto your OS images. The process is very similar to doing a manual install with one minor checkbox that has a different configuration. I'll show you here how you go through pre-installing that SCOM agent onto your OS images if you want that agent to be automatically available anytime you deploy out a new Windows server. And then lastly, we'll switch gears here to a slightly different topic that moves away from Windows Server and into our network devices. This configuration of network monitoring, at least at this point, focuses its attentions on your traditional up-down monitoring, do you respond to a ping or not, as well as the slightly deeper abilities to interface with your servers via SNMP. We'll talk about how to set up network monitoring against a router that we have here in the network, as well as the very simple process for setting up your SNMP community strings to gather just slightly more information out of those devices. Before we get into the click by click, however, I want to start here by talking about the different ways in which your agents can be installed onto your machines, including the way in which agents aren't installed at all. Most of the time, when you're talking about your agents and the systems that attach to your Operations Manager console, these are going to be agent managed systems, whereas you've deployed out an agent onto that Windows Server device. But this is not the only way in which you can actually manage some of those Windows Server instances that exist out there in your environment. There is also the abilities to manage them as an agentless managed system as well. With an agentless managed system, obviously there is no agent deployed out to that machine, but the result of which is that without that agent on those machines, there's quite a bit less information that can be gathered and brought back into the Ops Manager database. The presence of the agent on those Windows Server systems is what allows then the agent to gather up all that content and deliver it to your Ops Manager server. It's worth mentioning here also that the number of agentless managed systems that can be associated with an Ops Manager server is far, far less than the number of agent managed systems. I believe that for an earlier version of Ops Manager, we were limited to about 10 agentless managed systems per management server. And so you could only attach that management server to 10 individual systems that didn't have an agent installed. The reason for this is that when you do have an agentless managed system, there's more work that's required by the management server. It's the management server that has to go and request that information from that system, rather than having the agent gather all the information and then just deliver it back to your management server. And so whereas you can have many, many agent managed systems per management server, the number of agentless managed systems is far, far smaller. A primary reason for this is that the sheer amount of resources required to support an agentless managed system is quite a bit greater than for each agent managed system, again, because of all the extra work that your management server has to do. And so you tend not to integrate many of these agentless managed systems into your infrastructure, except in those rare situations where you have a machine that perhaps you don't have administrator rights on, or perhaps has a very locked down configuration that cannot support an agent to be installed onto it. For most situations, for nearly all situations, you will want to deploy an agent out to each Windows server so that it can do all the work in figuring out all the behaviors and then reporting that information back to your management server itself. This said now, let's talk a bit about these agent managed systems and the ways in which they can be deployed. Most of the time you'll find yourself using the baked-in SCOM discovery wizard as the tool for identifying which new resources exist and then deploying out agents onto those systems. If you have Windows servers in the environment, you can very easily query Active Directory for which servers exist and which ones need an agent, and then right there from within the Discovery Wizard, deploy out an agent to those machines to bring them into the SCOM infrastructure. It is, as you'll find out here in just a second, a very easy process to complete. And in fact, it's arguably the way in which you'll probably manage all of your Windows Server instances once you get your SCOM infrastructure up and in production. But this is obviously not the only way in which you can deploy out those agents. There are other manual-oriented ways in which agents can be installed. One is the traditional MSI exec approach in literally installing that agent onto another piece of hardware. This manual installation here in just a second, I'll show you what the silent switches are so that you can use that in silently deploying out this agent if you have need to through some software deployment solution. But the manual installation there, you can do so either through silent switches or via the traditional next finish wizard that exists there for really any software installation that you're used to working with. That manual installation can also be deployed out using PowerShell, so there is a separate way you can deploy it there using PowerShell, as well as the more common approaches in deploying out any kind of software in a data center environment. These are things like automated software deployment solutions like Configuration Manager or any of the third-party solutions that are out there, as well as group policy. Group policy is a way in which you can deploy out software, although these days is seeing less and less use as a solution for deploying software. And then lastly is that pre-installation of that agent right there onto a golden image that you then later deploy to servers using some OS deployment solution. All of these really kind of focus their attentions on the manual installation approach. And so once you really understand what the silent switches are, you can really expand that into any of these alternative approaches that are different from your traditional SCOM discovery wizard. Let us begin then with the approach that is easiest, simplest, and the most likely for you to use as you begin using this in production. That is through the Discovery Wizard that exists right here in the Operations Manager console. I'm back here on my desktop, so this is this Windows 10 desktop where we installed the Operations Manager console and then attached it to our DEN SCOM management group here on our server MGMT. Right down here under Device Management is where we will go about actually adding in these new devices as either agent-managed machines, agentless managed machines, or those that are pending management. Recall back on that last module, we made that configuration change to move any manually installed agents into this pending management queue so that we have some abilities to approve them before they end up actually bringing their data here into the database. Here for our agent-managed servers, let us run this Discovery Wizard to take a look at the different Windows computers that we can now bring here into the environment. You'll see here the first page of the wizard allows us to identify Windows computers, Unix and Linux computers, as well as network devices that we can now roll here into our Ops Manager infrastructure. Let's start here with Windows computers and run this Discovery Wizard against those machines that exist in the environment. The easiest of which is this automatic computer discovery, which will scan the existing Active Directory domain for all Windows-based computers. In a very small environment, this will bring back a very small amount of information, but in a much larger environment, as you might imagine, you're going to have a lot of machines you'll have to scroll through to figure out which ones need new Ops Manager agents. And so in many situations, running this advanced discovery is perhaps the better approach because it allows you to better tailor which kinds of machines you're going to be looking at. When you do run advanced discovery, you can run it against both servers and clients, or either servers or clients only. Notice here if you run it against servers only, that right down here, the verification of discovered computers is checked and then grayed out down here at the bottom. One caution here is that what this discovery does is essentially ask Active Directory for which servers exist in the Active Directory database. And then once it identifies which servers exist, it's this second task down here that verifies whether or not those machines are even on the environment. I think all of us are aware that our Active Directory database and the machine accounts in that database are sometimes not 100% aligned with the machines that actually exist in the environment. And so this verification can ensure that you don't end up deploying or attempting to deploy an agent out to a machine that doesn't actually exist. That said, though, in a very large environment where you have a lot of machines that are out there, this verification can take a really long period of time, so much so that in some circumstances you might actually time out the wizard itself. And so in that situation, if you're experiencing that problem, you may want to set this to servers and clients and not perform the verification here within the wizard. You can do your own verification through ping or even just knowing which systems actually exist on your own outside the wizard. For our uses here, however, let's do servers only and do the verification. We just have a couple of machines here on our Active Directory environment, so the process won't really take all that long to complete. If you are doing that verification, it's usually a good idea to identify either manually by typing in the computer names right down here, or by setting up an LDAP query up here at the top to focus down which machines on which you're attempting to verify. If I type in here, for example, let's say RDSH, this will then limit it to just this machine RDSH is the one that we're attempting to locate. Up here, however, is just a bit more flexibility in terms of which machines you can identify. If I choose Configure here, it's actually under the Advanced view, where I can choose which fields and then which values here correspond to the machines that I'm interested in looking at. So if I know I just want operating system starts with whatever, I can make that configuration change here. One thing you should know is that this configuration makes an LDAP query string that identifies which machines you'll be querying for. And so if I'm looking for example, RD star here, the query string that gets created is right here. SAM account name equals that, and name equals RD star. So this should identify just the RDS machines that we've configured here for the environment. If I click next down here, my next option is to choose which account I'll use for identifying those machines. If you recall, we created that action account that's admin on all the machines where we're going to do this integration. And so the management server action account, that MSAA account, is what I would want to use here. I could alternatively use another user account if I wanted to, or even a local computer account as opposed to a domain account. But in many situations, as long as these are domain joined machines, those that are in your data center, your MSAA account up here should be the one that should work just fine. Once I've chosen that, I'll hit the Discover button here to go through this discovery. And again, in a larger Active Directory environment, that discovery process could take a pretty long period of time. I need to identify every machine that I'm looking for here. I can see now which devices I want to manage, so the connection broker, the gateway, the RD session host, and the RDS web machine here. Let us bring our RDSH machine now under management here in this Ops Manager infrastructure and associate it to our management server, mgmt.company.pri. It's right down here where we pick which management mode we want to do for this machine, either agent or agentless for the management mode. You will not actually see me do any agentless management mode machines here in this environment, really throughout all the courses in this series. It's only by deploying out an agent to these machines that we get all the nice features that we'll later be working with as we start incorporating in those management packs and their additional knowledge. So you won't again see me do any agentless down here at the bottom, but that is a special use case for those where you don't really want to deploy an agent. Here, if I choose next, I have a couple of further options as well, which directory on which I want to install the agent, and then when the agent actually needs to then perform actions on that system, what kinds of permissions will that agent have to perform those activities? Will it be using a local system account or a specific Active Directory account that's required? In most situations, the local system account is sufficient for the types of actions that we'll later be performing. If you have actions that then need to attach to other resources, you may want to use an actual Active Directory account over here. This will make a lot more sense when we get into looking at the different tasks that can be performed on a machine once it's been brought into the infrastructure. So hold on to this and set this at local system at least for this point in time. I will choose Finish to deploy out this agent to that machine, which is a process that really doesn't take all that long. You can see here that rdsh.company.pri, the process has been started on that machine, and then after a couple of minutes, and me admittedly fast forwarding things a bit, you'll see that here that the agent deployment process is complete. Once you're done here, we can choose Close, and then the agent will now exist over here in our monitoring view, where after a period of time, we'll start getting monitoring information from that agent. We're not going to talk yet about that process. Actually, after the agent is installed, it still takes a period of time for information to exist over here. So don't worry if you see Not Monitored Yet here associated with the agents as soon as you install them. Give it a bit of time for it to do all its internal background processes before you start worrying about the health of that agent. Next up, let's go through the manual installation of an agent, which I will show you both the next finish approach there with the graphical user interface, as well as the silent switches that you'll need if you plan on using an automated deployment solution. For this, let's come over to our machine RDS web here, where we'll go through this next finish graphical installation. Right here on RDS web, I've brought up here the access to our SCOM 2016 content. Let me run then the setup for the SCOM installation. We've seen this before. It's here where we'll install the local agent option right down here. This local agent is, as you can see here, your traditional installation wizard here, where I choose to approve the license, where I choose the destination folder, and right here are some of the special configurations for the installation of that agent. If we have or want to connect the agent to Azure Log Analytics, we can configure it right down here. And then right down here is the connection of this agent to our System Center Operations Manager server. Let us go ahead and do that here, because at this point we don't actually have any kind of Active Directory integration in place for that information about which Ops Manager management server we should point towards. Without that AD integration in place, we need to manually populate the agent with where it needs to go. We don't have an Azure Log Analytics environment set up here at this point, so we can safely ignore this checkbox up here at the top. Let me choose Next down here to then configure what the management group name and the management server should be. If you recall, it's DEN for the name and then mgmt.company.pri for the management server. We have not adjusted our server port here, the default port, so we'll leave it as 5723, and choose Next here to identify which agent action accounts will allow it to then gather the data and then run those responses. This is similar to the second of the accounts that we looked at back on that last wizard, where we chose the local system as that onboard, this is local to this machine, that onboard account for performing those actions. We'll leave that as local system for now and choose Next. Do we want to then use Microsoft Update and checking for updates, or not to use Microsoft Update? We will choose Microsoft Update here so that we can get those agent updates automatically brought down as part of our usual update cycle. I'll choose Next again and then Install to complete this installation. This process takes only just a second or so. The agent's relatively small. And then once it completes, we should now be able to then approve this pending agent back over in our Ops Manager console. So let me hit finish over here and switch back to my desktop and take a look at the pending management queue to see indeed there's rdsweb.company.pri, which I will now need to then approve as an agent that I want to exist here in my Ops Manager infrastructure. I'll choose approve here, and then back here under agent managed, I should see now RDS Web is now existing in the list of 2 machines we've attached towards. Now this obviously helps you in that rare circumstance where you need to manually next finished an agent, but it does nothing for the silent switches that are required if you're using some kind of automated software deployment solution. And so let me show you what those switches are. These are not all of the switches that exist, but they are the ones that are most commonly used when you're making those configurations in Configuration Manager or Group Policy or what have you. First up, obviously, we'll be using MSI exec as the tool to install this. It does arrive as momagent.msi there on the DVD ISO file. And so we'll use the /i switch to point it to the MSI and /qn to run the installation quietly. We can choose then to identify whether or not we want to use the settings from Active Directory or local settings. If I set this to 1 as opposed to 0, I would then need to have my Active Directory integration components in place. So it would point to Active Directory to get all the rest of its information about which management server it would attach towards. If you're not using settings from Active Directory, though, you do then need to identify which management group and which management server DNS, so fully qualified domain name, you want to point this agent towards. If you recall, we already populated this information when we entered in that information into the next finish. Do we want then to use the computer account, or do we want to use an actual user account, a domain user account? These were also elements that we entered in back during that next finish. And then lastly, you always want to end with accepting the end user license agreement, so equal to 1 here, so that you can accept the license agreement and complete that silent installation successfully. These are really most of what you need. There are some additional silent switches you can find if you dig into TechNet, but for most installs, these are what's necessary to get that basic agent up and operational. And load balancing them around. For this environment, though, we're just going to use that very simple configuration to point all those machines here with this inclusion criteria. You may also want to build an exclusion rule. These exclusion rules allow you to identify which machines should not be automatically assigned using this rule. So the exclusion rule is a subset of the inclusion rule. Right down here under agent failover is where you determine then what the failover rules should be if the primary server should fail. So in a world where you've got agents pointing to a specific management server, what will happen if that management server fails for one reason or another? In many situations, just allowing the servers to manage failover there within those in the resource pool is usually the best configuration. But if you have other servers and you want to manually configure failover, you can do so right down here. We don't have any other management servers, so that's why you're not seeing any down here in the lower dialog box. I will choose automatically manage failover to allow the resource pool to determine where clients should go. And if I choose create here, that will go about now creating the rules that we've assigned for this machine MGMT. Right down here you can see for company.pri, this is the LDAP query that defines now which inbound unconfigured agents should be pointed to this machine MGMT. I'm also here because there are a couple of other items here. These are ones that you may have seen before. Our heartbeat settings, these we configured back in an earlier module. Our security settings, if we want to adjust, for example, how new manual agent installations are handled. This would be to override the settings that we've configured before. Also here are the proxy settings for whether or not this server will need to use a proxy server for any communication then with Microsoft. So these are the configurations here for your management server, and now we have a successful implementation of Active Directory integration. Now back in that last clip, you may have noticed that I skipped over one of the configurations in the properties of my management server. That configuration is one that right back over here under properties is here under the security settings for this server proxy. I mentioned in the introduction that there is the abilities to turn on what is termed agent proxy for any of the connected resources that exist here in your Ops Manager environment. And as you can see here by default, this server has the agent proxy configuration turned on. I want to warn you that although there is this warning here about a potential risk involved in allowing a server to discover managed objects, enabling this configuration for most environments these days is usually a best practice, and the potential risk is a minimal one compared to the additional benefits that you get. Recall that agent proxy is what allows a server to then discover further resources on behalf of your Ops Manager infrastructure. In a world where you have additional services like Active Directory or SharePoint or Exchange, or particularly Windows clustering, these additional services need to have agent proxy enabled so that that agent can then discover them on behalf of your ops manager infrastructure. Whereas this is actually checked here for my management server, right here under the other machines that are currently being agent managed, it may not necessarily be configured by default. And in fact, as you can see here, this machine and also the other machine are unselected for agent proxy. Many of the management packs, with all that knowledge we'll be later incorporating, require agent proxy to be enabled for them to do what they're doing, for them to discover those other resources. So it is usually a good idea for you to come in here for each of these machines and then enable agent proxy on each machine. You'll find that without this, some of the monitors that exist in those additional management packs just simply won't work. Now, this configuration is actually kind of annoying because you would have to go through here for each new machine and ensure that agent proxy has been enabled. But there is a way to change the default behavior for new resources as they're brought here into this list of those that are agent managed. Changing that default behavior requires just a bit of Windows PowerShell. So let's actually bring up a PowerShell command prompt here. This will need to be on a machine where you've got the Ops Manager console installed. We can't do that over on the remote machine MGMT because we don't have the console there on that machine locally. So let's do here, let us actually take a look at this process and how it works. For this, we need to begin by adding in a PS snap-in that corresponds here with Operations Manager, which I'm going to paste right here for my notes to the other side of the screen. So we'll do add PS snap-in Microsoft Enterprise Management Operations Manager Client. It's this PS snap-in that includes all the necessary bits for allowing us to then make this configuration change. Let me then copy in a second command here, which is the, if I paste it in here, new management group connection, with the connection string being to our management server, so MGMT. This will now set up the connections so I can make those further configurations. So I'm addressing what I'm about to do to that MGMT server. There on that server, I then need to CD essentially to the location where those settings exist. That is done with the set location command right here to Operations Manager Monitoring : In that location, I can then identify which settings actually exist. So if I do git default setting, this will give me all the settings that exist here in that location. All of these are settings that have to do with Operations Manager and its default configuration. So you can see here our partitioning and grooming settings, our alert customization, our custom field settings here, right up here our client monitoring settings, and all the way up here at the top is health service proxying enabled, which is set by default to false. Let us now reset this to true so that we can then automatically have agent proxy enabled on all new machines that arrive here in the environment. I have one further setting here that I need to configure, which I will copy and paste right here. Set default setting -name to health service /proxying enabled with a value equal to true. Once I've done this, now each new client will come in with that checkbox checked, allowing me then to use it as an agent proxy. Again, for your environment, although that note does exist there below the checkbox in the graphical user interface, many, if not most, of the management packs that we'll be working with do require that box to be checked. So you'll have to determine for yourself whether or not you want that box checked on all of your clients. Let me actually minimize this and show you that here, again, on my desktop. I'm not actually going to go through this installation at this point, but I do just want to show you that under the local agent install, there's one configuration you should be prepared for. Here, if I go through next and agree and next again, right here, this checkbox for connecting the agent to a System Center Operations Manager server, if you do plan on pre-installing that SCOM agent, make sure that this checkbox remains unchecked on the golden image itself. Then later, when your OS image is deployed, it's the image, once it enters into your Active Directory domain, that will use Active Directory integration, the Ops Manager Active Directory integration, to later then connect that agent to the Operations Manager server. So make sure that you uncheck this box here so that it does not be configured there on your golden images. Our final topic here is one that's a bit of a right turn from everything else we've been talking about, but is no less important. Everything we're talking about here has to do with the installation of agents onto Windows servers, and ostensibly also Windows desktops, although that's a conversation for later on. In addition to, though, our Windows servers, they're not the only resources we can attach towards. We can also configure network monitoring as well. Right down here under network management, our discovery rules here, this is the location where we can go about configuring network management then for the different devices that exist. And it's worth mentioning here that this discovery is more about ping responses, so up-down responses and SNMP responses, than is it any further more detailed integration with those network devices. That's a conversation for later on as we get into the management packs, because some management packs may include knowledge that references specific devices. But for now, for just having a basic understanding, either again through ping or through SNMP, it's right down here under network devices where we can run this discovery wizard and make those network integrations. I'll choose next down here to go to the next page of the wizard and then configure here a new name for the discovery that we're about to go through. Let's call this network discovery. And then right down here, which management server do we want to associate this with? So mgmt.company.pri. That server exists in an existing resource pool, although I could configure other resource pools of other servers if I wanted to isolate out this network management. I'll put that in our all management servers resource pool right down here because it is the one that we're configuring for all of our management here so far. The discovery method we have here is either explicit or recursive discovery. So with recursive discovery, essentially you're going to allow the discovery to continue to find additional resources as it goes out throughout the network. For our purposes here, we don't have a very complex network here in the lab, so we will choose explicit discovery to explicitly define which resources we want to monitor. Now, as I said, there are two different ways in which you can do this. One is just simple ping packets, and the other is SNMP. If you are using SNMP, you will need to create an account that contains the community string for reading that information off that device. I can create that account right up here. This account right here then would have a display name, so SNMP community string. And then for that display name, I need to punch in what the community string would be. So in many cases, it's public, or whatever you've configured that community string to be. This would be the read string. Once I've configured that, I can click Create here to make that the Run As account if I do plan on using SNMP for getting more detailed information off those network devices. Obviously, SNMP has to be turned on, enabled, and properly configured on each device for this to work. If I choose Next then, I can choose which devices I want to then import. In my environment, I only have one device that I'm interested in, and that device will be the default router for all these machines, 192.168.3.2. In your environment, it's usually 3.1. Here in VMware Workstation, it tends to be .2, but this is the default router for all the equipment that I have here inside of my VMware Workstation lab that I'm working with. I can choose ICMP or SNMP or both for which of these I'm interested in, as well as which SNMP version I want to use, 1 or 2 or version 3. And then if I do so, which account do I want to use? So right down here for 1 and 2, there's my SNMP community string account. For these now, I don't actually have SNMP enabled on these devices. Again, it's just a VMware Workstation construct that isn't listening for SNMP requests. So for this very simple environment, let's just simplify things down a bit further and use ICMP exclusively. ICMP, as I said, will limit things down to just whether or not that device responds to a ping command, but for this very simple environment, it gives me the information I'm looking for. Let me choose OK down here to define 3.2 as the device I'm looking for, and then choose Next. How often do I want to run this discovery rule to find additional devices? So which days of the week and which time of the day? Or do I want to run the discovery rule manually? So I can choose to schedule that network discovery if I want to. Once I've done so, let me choose Next here and then Create to go about now creating that discovery rule. Notice here that because I've created that SNMP community string Run As account, it needs to be distributed to all the different machines that exist in that management pool. We only have one machine here, so we really only need to deploy it to that one computer. Let us now distribute the accounts and create the discovery here. And then once it's been created, let's run the network discovery as well. And then fast forwarding things just a bit, this network discovery, after a couple of minutes here, should then populate down here under network devices with the, right here, the 3.2 address that we've configured. So we now have this existing here on our list of network devices. Later on, as we get into monitoring, we should be able to see then the success of monitoring against that 3.2 device. But for now, just recognize that this is the way in which you would set up either a manual or a scheduled discovery for any of those network devices. So perhaps an unexpectedly large amount of content here for discovering those resources and installing the agents. What have we talked about in this module? We've gone through exactly the steps you need to go through for the many different ways in which you could deploy an agent out to your machines. We talked first about what those deployment options are. So whether it be software deployment or even the discovery wizard there in the operations console, there are a variety of ways in which agents can be deployed. We then went through that graphical user interface to discover Windows Server resources and even talked a bit about some of the manual ways to install a SCOM agent. We then went through the extra steps necessary to configure and make available Active Directory integration if you do want to turn it on in your environment, and also how to turn on Agent Proxy and enable it by default for any new resources coming in. We spent a very quick minute there on pre-installing the SCOM agent, making sure to unselect that one checkbox there for actually connecting up to an Operations Manager infrastructure, and then took a quick sidestep there into network monitoring, giving us the abilities to extend this whole monitoring infrastructure into the non-Windows devices that connect our Windows servers together. Coming up next, we finally get to actually take a look at the monitoring that we're configuring here in our Operations console. In that next module, we'll take a look at the different views that exist, the alerts view, the diagrams view, even some of the more advanced views that exist, even just in this initial integration of Operations Manager with the other resources in our environment. We'll poke through a day in the life of Operations Manager in operations and give you a feel for the kinds of information that this whole infrastructure will deliver when it comes time to use it in production. That conversation on exploring monitoring with the Operations console is the topic for our next module. Coming up. Let us pause the configuration here for just a minute to explore what we hath wrought with this Operations Manager infrastructure we're constructing. Here for this module, I don't actually want to do anything. Rather, I want to focus our attentions there on what we can see now in those monitoring views through what is admittedly a very basic implementation here so far. We, at this point, have only made the initial integration of our agents onto those Windows Server machines. We haven't really done much more than that, except for that single connection we made there with network monitoring. And so what we have here is effectively a very basic monitoring solution that lets us know some very basic things about those Windows servers. So with that, let's go through just the items that we see here inside the Operations console as we start taking a look at the different Windows servers that exist there in our infrastructure. We'll take a look at the discovered inventory view and also the distributed application that Ops Manager has already created for us. Back in that introduction course, I talked about this future expectation of there being this service model that logically represents all the different interconnections and dependencies between these Windows servers. We don't have that yet because we haven't programmed that here into Operations Manager, except in the single circumstance for our Ops Manager infrastructure itself. The creation of that Ops Manager infrastructure automatically also creates a very small service model for that infrastructure. And so we can take a look at what we will later see as we start programming those in later on here in this learning path. While we're here, I want to show you the diagram and state views and how they can help you visualize the different objects there in the environment, and focus most of our attentions here on Health Explorer. This Health Explorer, which is something that's not immediately visible there inside the interface, is where you may find yourself spending a lot of time when you go through troubleshooting the various issues your servers can experience. That Health Explorer can work along with the performance view and also the alert views there to provide information about the behaviors of those systems and any error messages that they may be experiencing. While you're working on troubleshooting those systems, you may also need to perform various tasks like logging into the system or running a ping command against it. Ops Manager here provides a short list of tasks that can sometimes be useful as you are indeed troubleshooting various issues across the servers in your environment. Now back over here on my desktop, I've got the Ops Manager console right down here. You should know that I've gone through adding all the rest of the machines in this environment here into the Ops Manager monitoring view. So the same task in installing those agents that we did back in that last module, we'll go ahead and complete that process for all the rest of the resources that we have. Again, remember that you do need to wait a bit after the installation of that agent. It just takes a period of time for the agent to gather all the necessary information and make it available here inside your Operations console. Let's start our review here. Let's start our exploration not with the active alerts, but rather with our discovered inventory view here. One thing you should also know is that here in the environment, after installing the agent, I went through and powered down the machine RDCB. I powered it down to try to simulate here what would happen if we end up in that situation where we have a machine that is offline. And it's here where you can see we have a couple of different and very interesting responses that are perhaps unexpected from what you might think of here in the environment. I have my machine, my desktop, so this is my Windows 10 machine that's showing as critical, although obviously I'm on my desktop here at this point. Perhaps the issue that is showing here as critical has nothing to do with the up versus down nature of this Windows desktop. And also up here, the machine RDCB that actually is down right now and can't be communicated with, obviously it's because it's powered down, it is showing as healthy. However, if you notice very carefully here, we have a gray checkbox here as opposed to a green checkbox. So this may be an unexpected situation for you if you really want to be notified when you have a machine that is down. Obviously, this is a concern, and you'll want to perhaps make some configuration changes so you are notified when systems go down. But for now, let's focus our attentions on perhaps why this is the situation, as opposed to actually making those configuration changes. Here in Discovered Inventory, you can see that list of machines on which I have agents currently assigned, and right here are all those machines that exist. These machines, in addition to those that exist over here in Distributed Applications, also represent the different kinds of objects that Operations Manager is currently looking at. And this you can really consider to be kind of the top level stoplight chart, that single green versus red representation for the overall health of each of these different objects. All of these here are designed to give you, again, that single page view for how everything is looking here inside the environment. I'll come back to Discovered Inventory here in just a second. I want to focus our attentions here on this single distributed application that's been configured. And again, we'll talk more about how you actually construct these in the next course as we tune our connections to our Windows Server resources. But for right now, let's actually take a look then at how we can dig just a bit further into what we're seeing here for our Operations Manager management group and its distributed application. To do that, we have a couple different views over here that we can review that include the alert view, the diagram view, the event performance, and also the state view. The state view here for any particular object provides really a long list of all the potential classes of monitors that could be associated here with this object. And as you can see here, this is a very long list of potential monitors that exist. So operating systems, infrastructure groups, report console watchers, sites, standard data sets, all the way over here to the right. This long list over here actually gets very long in terms of all the different things that you could monitor here right out of the box. We will talk more about management packs and modules to come, but recognize also that management packs can add additional columns here to this list, as well as enable different monitors that can be turned on across all these different states that a machine could currently exist in. Right now, with just the very basic configuration that we have here, you'll notice that pretty much all of these different items here, all the different monitors, are currently unmonitored. It is that process of adding in those management packs and then tuning the experience here that will later turn on these monitors where they're appropriate for the different servers, services, and applications that we may have. You'll find here as we get into the list later on, different types of monitors will or will not be relevant for different types of servers. So even in an infrastructure where you may have turned on a monitor, it may not be relevant to a particular server or service, so you won't actually see it monitored in this view here. This state view actually perhaps makes a bit more sense when we look at it not through this distributed application, but rather here under Discovered Inventory for one of the machines that we may have. Here for this SQL machine, let's take a look then at our state view right down here so we can see just ever so slightly how different this SQL server may look. Right over here, we can continue to scroll all the way over to the right, and you know what? Right now, with no management packs, we still don't really have much here in terms of what we're actually monitoring on this SQL server. All that knowledge, all that additional information comes as we add in those MPs just a bit later. In addition to these state views, though, at least for right now, until we can populate that with further information, let's take a look at the diagram view for this distributed application. As I said, this diagram view here really is the logical representation of the different components that make up our Operations Manager management group. And so if I hit diagram view right here, what you'll see is a tree view representation of, in this case, those that are not monitored and those that are healthy here for our Ops Manager infrastructure. Every diagram view will be a little bit different based off of how you configure that service model, how you actually build the distributed application later on in the authoring phase. And so as you work here with Ops Manager, you'll develop kind of an innate understanding of exactly how you are building these or how your different management packs are building them on your behalf. Here for your Ops Manager infrastructure under Healthy is where we can drill down to find out more information about each individual item. Here are the groups showing items from A through I, from MA through MI, and then from M through W down here. And if I go one level down, you can see here just more information for those items that are between letter A and letter I. Here is our all management group right here, our all management servers, the data access service group properties, our databases, and then our infrastructure group. And the further that I drill down here, I find out more and more information about, for example, our data warehousing and operations database. And then even further, if I can scroll down successfully here, all the way at the bottom, the database watch rate properties for all of those management servers. We will later on, as I said, get into more details about what we're seeing here, but for now, recognize this gives you at least a top-down view of the health of each individual item that makes up this distributed group. Now, you may be saying to yourself, this diagram view is great, but if I don't really understand what goes into the diagram view, knowing if something is a green versus a red doesn't really help me much in my troubleshooting process. It's for that reason that there actually is a very different view that can be handy when you're taking a look at either your distributed applications or your discovered inventory. That is one that I mentioned is sometimes perhaps not the easiest to find here as we're looking through all these different items. The Health Explorer view is another tree view where we can identify all the different monitors that are associated with an object and roll up their vision of health, again, into that single green versus red checkbox to let us know whether something is healthy or not today. I say that's sometimes difficult to locate here because if we pick one of our objects here and choose to open up the Health Explorer right here, right out of the box, there's not much that you actually see right here. The reason for that is that the Health Explorer view by default will only show you those child monitors that are considered unhealthy. If you choose here to unfilter the monitors, this is where it explodes out the entire view to give you a feeling for all the different objects that make up this picture of health for our server RDSH. Down here I have them divided into availability, configuration, performance, and security health roll-ups. And you'll find these four are associated with every object that you work with here in Ops Manager. For our availability view, I can break it down to identify more objects, or really more monitors that are available. Here's our Windows local application health roll-up here. And there under availability is just more and more detail about, for example, the audit collection forwarder, any network monitoring timeouts, my WMI service availability for the WMI service, and so on and so on. These are all what are available right out of the box. We have not added in any management packs that add additional monitors or turn on monitors that exist here. We've also done no configuration to enable those monitors that, as you can see here, are currently unmonitored to this point. So don't worry at this point that you see several of these that are green circles and showing as unmonitored. There's some further work that can be necessary for many of these to provide more information about what that monitor intends to do. For now, recognize that this Health Explorer view is later on, as you actually begin monitoring actual services, this becomes the place where you can really dig down to identify why a particular object is not showing as healthy today. Like, for example, my desktop right down here. This my desktop machine is showing as critical, which means that we should probably take a look at why this is not actually being shown as a healthy machine today. If I go here to Health Explorer, you can see why the healthy child monitors are the ones that are removed from the initial view. With all those monitors that are available there in the list, it can sometimes be difficult to find out exactly why a particular monitor or where that monitor actually exists. Right down here is our WMI Health monitor associated with this machine, mydesktop.company.pri. And it's the one that's showing here currently as critical. If I unfilter the monitors here to show you all the other monitors that exist, it is the only one in the list that's actually showing as critical. A single monitor in this circumstance is all that's necessary to flip that green over to a red and identify that a problem is occurring. Right here, when I take a look at this health monitor, over on the right-hand pane, you can see knowledge that's associated with the monitor. This monitor has been built by Microsoft. It's part of the built-in management packs that exist when you first install the system. And because the monitor knows what it's looking for, Microsoft or whoever writes that monitor can provide information about perhaps why the monitor is showing critical as opposed to healthy. For this particular monitor here, we can see that the WMI Health monitor tried to run the WMI query select star from Win32 operating system and incurred a WMI error right down here. This is the case, or possibly the case, because WMI is unhealthy and cannot return data. And then here are a list of possible resolutions that you can perform to try to resolve the issue there on that machine. Be aware that sometimes these resolutions don't actually solve the problem. Sometimes the actual problem can be somewhere else. This is particularly the case when you have multiple monitors that are showing as critical as opposed to healthy. But this is, in this case, Microsoft's representation of what you might do or begin to do in order to resolve the issue for this machine. You can also see over here state change events. So when did this monitor go from, in our case here, unmonitored to critical? And then also some further details about the error message that it receives. I'm not going to go through actually troubleshooting this error message. You'll find as you start plugging this into your other servers that depending on really the length of service of that server and how it's been managed over time, you may find multiple different critical items that you were entirely unaware of for each of the servers that you plugged in here so far. For now, though, be aware that for this machine and for this health monitor, after you've gone through all that effort to try to troubleshoot the issue and you believe you've fixed the problem, one way in which you can turn this red back to green is by resetting the health on this particular monitor. If I reset the health here from red to green, it will go through changing the state of that monitor there. Once it's changed the state of the monitor, you'll see we're reloading our Health Explorer, and indeed, well, it looks like even though we've changed the state, we still have some issues that we have to work with here. We have our roll-up right here, our Windows Local Application Health roll-up, which rolls up to configuration, which rolls up to our total entity health right here. I've actually gone through and fixed the WMI Health monitor down here, but I would need to then continue by resetting the health for those monitors, those roll-up monitors that exist above it in the tree. Let me come here and reset the health now for this machine and complete this process to allow it to then recalculate the health for me. And if I've done everything correctly here, we should see that, yep, this machine now is considered to be healthy. Resetting this health monitor does nothing for actually fixing the problem. This is assuming that you've obviously fixed the problem on that machine. You're just resetting the monitor to turn it back from red to green. Be aware that if you have not actually fixed the problem, after a period of time, if the monitor is configured to recheck those values, if they are still in a failure state, well then that green monitor will return itself back to red. You're not really solving any problems here by just simply resetting the health. Now, be aware that there are ways in which you can override a particularly noisy monitor, which is a task we'll talk about in the next course coming up, the whole process of configuring overrides. Microsoft and the other management pack builders sometimes build monitors that are a bit too noisy, that require some further tuning, and it is the use of these overrides in the authoring panel where we can adjust the actual response if for some reason we don't really care about a monitor, or if we want to adjust what the threshold for that monitor tripping from green to red should be. For now, though, be aware that this is the tool that you can use, Health Explorer, to help you drill down into the individual root causes, which could later end up becoming a problem. Not every problem has to do with a configuration error. Some issues have to do with performance and overutilization of resources on a machine. It's for that reason that we also have performance views for our computers, which we can take a look at here if we pick yet another machine. Here's our SQL Server. Here for this performance view, we can select which of the performance counters that we've configured so far. So which ones are actually we are collecting right down here at the bottom. So our system uptime, for example, being one counter. Our send size queue, our agent processor information. Any of these are ones that are available here. Again, these are just the ones that are being collected here for this machine at this point. And again, as you can see here, because we haven't downloaded any of the management packs here so far, the kind of performance views that we have, or the metrics that we're collecting here, are not going to be the full set that you're used to gathering off of any Windows machine using perfmon. This is by design. If you look at perfmon, you'll see a very large number of counters that are associated with any Windows machine, and those counters can increase with different types of roles, services, and applications that are installed. And if you've ever tried to turn on perfmon with lots and lots of counters on a machine, you're aware that just the gathering of that information can actually reduce the amount of resources that are available for running its applications. So Ops Manager is not necessarily here as a solution to gather every perfmon counter, but rather to gather those that are appropriate for the different kinds of management packs that you've configured for these machines. You don't want to gather all that data because you don't want to store it here in the database. You don't want to gather all that data because you don't want to have to worry about all the efforts in managing the gathering of that data. So right now, as you can see here, we just have a couple of counters related mostly to the health service, so the health of the agent itself. But this view will give you more important information as we start adding in more management packs here into our infrastructure. The same holds true with event log data. If you look at the event log on any particular machine, oftentimes that event log is full of really noise, not really useful information about what's going on that machine. All too often, our services and applications just provide a lot of stuff, sometimes raw information that gets thrown into that database for later gathering. But all too often, the throwing of that information in the database makes it that much harder for us to troubleshoot a problem. It's for that reason that even here under active alerts, we're not going to see what you would normally see in an event log for any particular Windows server. Rather, we're going to see the types of alerts that relate to the types of management packs that are currently here in our Ops Manager infrastructure. And so there may be other issues on those machines, but as you can see here, the types of alerts that we're seeing here so far relate to mostly just the health of the Ops Manager client here at this point. So maybe we have an admin user role that needs some attention here. It needs at least one domain account. Maybe the management health service has unloaded some system rules here for one machine, like our machine dc.company.pri. A PowerShell script, as you can see here, has failed to run on my desktop. And right up here, you can see that we indeed have failed to connect to that machine RDCB, which is why the stoplight for that machine is currently in the gray state as opposed to being in the red state. We know that we can't get access to the health service on that machine, the agent on that computer, and not being able to gather data turns that icon to gray as opposed to turning it to red. Different management packs that we add in later on will obviously change the rules for different situations. So as we later get into the implementation of those management packs, you always want to be cautious about which ones you implement and be aware of what the results can be for which behaviors get monitored, which ones generate alerts, and which ones now change greens to reds as opposed to gray. As we saw before with the Health Explorer view, any of these alerts can also be resolved if we've solved the problem over there on that machine, or if we just want the alert to go away so we can see if it comes back at a later time. To resolve any of these issues, we can right-click on the individual alert and set the resolution state here to something other than new, like closed or resolved, for example. These later resolution states can remove these alerts from the view right here, then freeing ourselves to be able to view other items on other machines. Now, while we're here, you'll notice that we spent most of our time here really on, what is this, the first three of the items that exist here in the tree. But there are other items, other folders of items that exist down here on the bottom, here on the left-hand pane. These correspond with some of the other management packs that have already been incorporated here into the system. And it's really here where sometimes some of the confusion with Operations Manager can reside. Different management packs will add different series of folders in here that they themselves include other types of views. So for example, our Microsoft Windows Server view here will include additional views here for active alerts, for operating system performance, and for task status. At this point, you'll notice that we don't actually even have any information here in our list of performance counters. And if we took a look here at our operating system state, we don't have any information here for the state of these operating systems themselves. This is the case again because there are more management packs to be incorporated here into the infrastructure. This is, as I keep saying, a task we will perform later on. But mainly for now, I want to give you the warm fuzzy that if you don't see any information in here, be aware that that's actually an okay situation for what we have here so far. There are other management packs that will provide further information and start actually populating those servers here into these additional views. We do have, let's see here, we have our Operations Management Suite that includes other views like configuration alerts on that Operations Management Suite, also the health state for that Operations Management Suite right here. So some of these are not necessarily always going to have the kinds of information that you may expect they have until a little bit later on. We have our network monitoring here, which is the network monitoring we configured up back on that last module. Recall that when we set up network monitoring, we set it up against a single machine here, 192.168.3.2, which shows us here that indeed we are healthy. And I can continue to go through the alert, the diagram, and the event view for that IP address if I should so choose. Again, for our purposes here, it's best to just spend some time getting a feel for what kinds of views exist in all of these folders. We'll spend quite a bit more time here working with the content of these folders as we get into the next course and tuning that whole experience and monitoring our Windows Server resources. Now, one final thing to look at here in the interface as we close out this module and exploring the operations console are the tasks that are made available depending on where you're actually clicking here in the monitoring pane. Right down here, you can see the node tasks that exist for, in our case, the hosts view here for our IP address 3.2. These node tasks, ping, SNMP get, walk, telnet console, and traceroute, are those that have been configured here in this management pack, although it's not technically a management pack here for network monitoring, for this view. And each of these tasks down here in the lower right will evolve based off of what kind of different resource, what kind of object you're connected to. If I take a look here at discovered inventory and healthy, right down here are the Windows computer tasks that are associated with that object. These have been configured in that management pack. And so each new MP that you install here into the Ops console will bring with it a set of additional computer tasks that you can perform. For these, they provide you, again, a very easy way to, for example, ping the computer and find out whether or not that machine is up and operational, to view its computer management view here, to take a look at, for example, its remote desktop, and so on and so on. These are provided here so that from this single pane of glass, you have the abilities to get some basic information to help you troubleshoot the situations that you're experiencing here. Like, for example, our My Desktop machine, where the healthy has now re-evolved back to critical because the monitor threshold's been tripped. So we still have some work to do for that machine, My Desktop, and we have now some of the tools we can use for helping ourselves really dig down to the real reason why this machine is unhealthy. I find it helpful to take this sidestep away from the configuration at exactly this point because there really is a lot to process, a lot to digest there in the operations console. And when you start clicking into the authoring view, which is where we do more of the tuning of these monitors and tasks and rules, it's over there where things get quite a bit more complicated. That authoring view is a topic for our next course as we get into tuning that experience against our Windows Server resources. But before we did that, I think it's valuable here to get an appreciation for what we can monitor right out of the box. What have we talked about in this module? We've gone through just a cursory review of the operations console and several of its different views there, limited to just the monitoring pane there in the console. We took a look at our discovered inventory as well as where those individual servers can be consolidated together to create a distributed application, and the single distributed application that is built for us by the installation of Operations Manager. From there, we dug into the diagram and state views. We took a very deep look at Health Explorer and how it really does a good job, once it's been well tuned, for identifying which sometimes deeply buried misconfigurations can later create a much bigger problem on any individual object. We looked very cursorily there at the performance view because there aren't all that many performance counters yet here in the infrastructure. We also looked at the alert view and explored the different tasks that are available depending on which of the objects that we select. Coming up next, we'll take everything we have here and then augment it with the reporting server feature of Operations Manager. In that next module, we'll go through the installation of Reporting Server and take a look at some of the reports that can now exist for the servers we've attached towards. We obviously at this point have quite a bit of visualization for the health of each individual object in our environment, but it's with this implementation of Reporting Server that we get even more detail about exactly what's going on in the services we're monitoring. That conversation on the installation of Reporting Server and the management of reporting is the topic for our next module coming up. With the core of our Ops Manager infrastructure now in place and monitoring enabled, we turn now to what are, the mundanities of the additional configurations that are required. This I referred to in the introduction to this course as the Part 2, where we go through a variety of different additional tasks. These are just the things you'll want to lay into place to complete your infrastructure. Starting here first with the installation of Reporting Server and also the managing of reporting. Now, I refer to this as the mundanities, not because reporting is unimportant. You may find yourself actually using reporting quite a bit as it gathers all the different metrics from the machines in your environment. But rather, the actual installation of Reporting Server and the management of reporting is a relatively trivial activity. In many ways, it's almost a very common sense activity once you understand exactly how SQL SSRS works. To that end, though, let's go through then the configuration here of SQL Server reporting services there on our machine SQL. This process has us running through a wizard there in the configuration of reporting services, which prepares us then for the installation of SCOM's reporting server components. This installation uses the same installer, the same setup routine that we used before in installing our management server and also our console. So you're kind of familiar at this point with how that installation actually works. It is that install that gets us to the point where we can go through generating and running the reports that exist here right out of the box. It's worth mentioning too that additional reports will get added as you start adding in different management packs, but there are a series of those that are available just right here in the beginning, so you can take a look at some of the data that our agents are now collecting and storing there in the database. The most salient difference between what we've seen already in the monitoring view there in the operations console and what we get out of reports is that these reports tend to include more historical information and can be generated over a regular period of time and, as you can see down here, scheduled and delivered to users outside of that whole need to connect there to the operations console. If you have users that have requirements to see data in a report, it becomes relatively easy then to schedule and then email or otherwise deliver that report to those users. And here at the end, we'll talk about that process of actually getting those reports out to the people who require them. We begin that process back over here on our SQL server. This is sql.company.pri, where we'll go through now the configuration of SSRS. Let me here then bring up the reporting services configuration wizard here, the little tool that you use for configuring SSRS, and then pointing it here to our SQL server, sql.company.pri. I do have to maximize this so we can get access to the apply and exit buttons down here at the bottom. You'll notice here that for the report server, we have an initial configuration made, and in fact, the report service status is currently set to started, but we have not yet configured a database or even what the report server mode will be for this machine. It's worth mentioning that Operations Manager does support SSRS in native mode only. There is a separate SharePoint integrated mode you can use, but Ops Manager does not support that mode, so you'll need to set this up in native mode only. It's worth also mentioning that the SCOM reporting server, so we'll install that server over the top of this here in just a second, but that SCOM reporting server is the only service that can attach here to the SQL instance that we're working with. No other services, no other applications can attach or make use of that instance. So if you have a large SQL cluster that you're using as the storage location for this data, you'll want to make sure that you install a separate instance for the use by Operations Manager before we get here to this point. Our first task here in setting up SSRS involves really just stepping through the long list of items down here on the left-hand column, beginning first with the identification or identifying the service account that we want to use. Recall earlier, back when we went through the initial configuration of SQL Server, that we went through altering a couple of the accounts that exist here and replacing them with Active Directory accounts. It was the SQL SVC account right here and right here. And at that time, I told you that when we got to Report Server, we would want to also replace this internal virtual account with that SQL SVC account, or another Active Directory domain account. Let's go through that process here and replace the virtual service account with another account right here, which will be in our case company/SQL SVC and the password there associated with that account. So let us apply this now to replace that virtual service account with this Active Directory domain account. For each of these applications, they'll see down here that we then have to make some changes and then in some cases restart then the services here so that we can make use now of these different configurations as we do them. Once we've made this change, we step down to the next item right here where we see the virtual directory to be used by this instance, and then the IP addresses, the TCP ports, and whether or not we want to use that HTTPS certificate there to make this a secured connection. For our configuration here, we do actually have an HTTPS certificate on this machine, so we can adjust this over to sql.company.pri and set this up against port 443. So this gives you just, again, the abilities now to run this as an HTTPS configuration because we did enroll for that certificate back in the introduction course, the one before this one. Let me again hit apply here to adjust now, or really make that binding then to that HTTPS port there. Once I've done that, then the next step in the process, after this process completes, is to then go up to the database and to create a report services database that will then be consumed by our Ops Manager reporting services implementation as we go through that installation. That configuration, after just a minute or two of fast forwarding here, happens right up here under the database, the third item here in the left-hand pane. It is worth mentioning down here that after you've created that web service URL, you can click here to identify whether or not you can successfully attach then to that URL. I'll show you here that if we run the selection and open it up here in Internet Explorer, we will see kind of a partial configuration here so far. We don't have the complete configuration, so we're not actually going to see a complete success. But what we do see here is indeed the IIS website is receiving and then responding to the request. So let's continue then with our configuration down here under the database, where we can create a new report server database there on our SQL server. Let us now choose to change the database here and to create a new report server database to be used by this report server. We'll connect here to our database server. That's our SQL server again, same machine here. In this case, I can use my username gshields because I'm really just doing this in order to create the database. Here we'll create this database report server. It's an English database, and we'll use the service credentials that already exist here. That's SQL SVC. If I choose next and then finish over here, this will now go through the generation of that new database to be used by that reporting server. Once it's completed, I can choose finish here, and that takes us now to the next step in the process, which is our web portal URL over here on the left-hand pane. Again, this will populate this second item down here for the report server database credential. Down here is our web portal URL, which you can see here is the reports view. And again, we have these two URLs that are configured here so far. To apply this virtual directory name, which is the /reports virtual directory, I will hit apply right down here. And again, after a couple of minutes of fast forwarding, you can see that we've now configured the virtual directory. Our next step here is now the email settings, which provide a report server email address with which to then deliver these reports later on. Here's where we'll enter in our sender address, our SMTP delivery method, which is to use an SMTP server, and then if we have an SMTP server in the organization, which one will we use? We don't have one here, so let's just put in a bogus one, so smtp.company.pri with no authentication. And we'll also put in a bogus address here, so reports@company.pri as being the email address that we'll use. This obviously would need to be an email server that would accept and relay then an authenticated email, or one where you could actually configure authentication against. So that obviously is a topic for another day, but this is the way that you can set this up as the email address for reports coming from this server. So far, most of these are relatively self-explanatory, except for perhaps this execution account, which exists right here in the middle. This execution account is here in order to provide read access to the database for performing really the collection and generation of reports. We already here have a read-oriented operations manager account that's designed here for the data warehousing database. That's our OM read account. And that account has the necessary permissions already there on the database to be able to do what we need to do here. So for this, let's actually configure our execution account to be that company/OM read account. We'll put in the password here for the account and then confirm the password for the account. But really, this just needs to be a domain user account with minimal permissions that can perform those read-only operations there on the database and generate the reports. So let me hit apply here to then apply this there to our reporting services infrastructure. You may want to then copy and then back up your encryption keys, which is a process you can accomplish here under the encryption keys view. And also down here under subscription settings, define another Active Directory account, which will have permissions to then deposit these reports, perhaps into a file share. In some circumstances, you may not want those reports actually being emailed to users, but rather deposited onto a file share where they can be kept for archival purposes. And so if you have another account here, I'll just cheat and use our same OM read account. As long as that OM read account has the appropriate permissions on the file shares that you'll later configure, this is the account that can be used for then depositing those reports into those locations. So I'm not necessarily saying that OM read is the correct account here, but one which has the correct permissions for then depositing those reports in those locations. Ultimately, what we're looking for here is right down here under Scale Out Deployment to see indeed that we do have a SQL Server, a report server database name, the mode here set to enabled, and the status is joined here for our Scale Out Deployment. If all of these have been configured, then we know we've got a successful initial configuration of SSRS in preparation for that Ops Manager reporting server installation. With SSRS now configured, we could now go through the installation of the SCOM reporting server components that'll layer over the top. I'm still back here on sql.company.pri, and I have my Ops Manager installation setup screen here, where we can once again go through that install, just like we did with our management server. The process here is more or less the same as the management server. There's just a couple of different screens where you'll need to enter in information. Right down here is our reporting server, and if I choose next here, we can then identify our installation location and then once again go through that prerequisite check there for hardware and software. One curious item here, or one curious behavior, is that before actually filming, I attempted to run through this hardware and software checker without having SSRS configured appropriately, and I still passed all the prerequisites. So be aware that you do have to go through that SSRS configuration first, even if you do see a success over here in this wizard page. We now know that we have everything set up appropriately, so if I hit next here and accept the license terms, I'll have a fairly long list of wizard pages that I need to click through. The first of which is my management server name, so mgmt.company.pri. Again, that's the management server we installed before. Once we've identified that, we can choose then our SQL Server instance here. Be aware that this SQL Server instance needs to have, if I click down here, the SQL Server agent service turned to automatic and then running for it to successfully get through this page of the wizard. I don't believe we had that set up earlier, so if you're following along, make sure that you set the agent there to automatic and then turn on the agent. If you've done that, then if I hit next here, that should take us to the next page in the wizard. This is our data reader account. So again, that's going to be company omread and then the password for that omread account. Once we've done that, that takes us to our diagnostic and usage data screen, just the warning there, and then our installation summary. This now goes through the installation of reporting services here onto this machine. Here in the clip coming up next, we'll then go through the generating and the running of those reports that reporting services will now work with. Be aware that it's usually a good practice to allow this to just sit for about 30 minutes or more after the installation completes before you actually start working with reports. There, as with the management server install, are going to be some background activities that need to occur. So give it, as I said, about a half an hour before you actually start working with those reports, like what we'll see in the clip coming up. And then after the requisite 30 minutes, plus a couple of more minutes to go grab another cup of coffee, we can now see here that the setup is complete. So I can hit the close button here to close down the installation and then switch back over here to my desktop, where you can see that I've actually restarted the operations console here in order to have access now to a new tab right down here at the bottom, the reporting tab. So this is essentially everything that we've seen here so far, except right here under reporting is where we have access to all of these reports that are being generated or can be generated over there on the reports server. As I mentioned, right out of the box, we have a long list of reports that are made available through the management packs that we currently have here on this system, which are just the ones that were installed as part of that initial installation. We also have the ability down here to then reference any custom authored reports that we may have created. This is really a topic that goes way beyond our conversation today. In order to create your own custom authored reports, you'll be writing your own T-SQL queries against your Operations Manager database, also writing report definitions with parameter blocks and injecting all that into separate management packs that you create yourself. So this is a fairly complex task considering what we're talking about here, but the extensibility does exist for you to create your own authored reports if you're ready to write your own code. For the reports that exist here, though, let's take a look at just some of the ones that exist. We have our client monitoring views here. We have the data warehouse reports, just the availability, the events that exist. We also have this generic report library here, which gives us a nice list of those reports that we can see here right at this point. I want to dig into just a couple of these just to give you a familiarity for how you can then generate these reports and then later deliver them or schedule their delivery. And I do this in part because the way in which you gather the different objects that the report will run against begins our process of understanding how Ops Manager deals with its different objects, which in and of itself will require some effort on your part to figure out exactly what you need. Let's take a look at just a pair of these. The first one being our availability report here. Obviously, this will show us then the availability over a period of time for an object that exists there in the database, which in our case here is probably going to be a Windows server. Let's choose to open this report, and once we open it, we have to define the parameters for how the report will run. So what will be our data aggregation, hourly or daily, and then the time period for the report. So how about yesterday to today, a 24-hour period? Over that 24-hour period, using the time zone here for Mountain Time, we now need to identify which objects we want to run the report against. It's here where things start to get a bit complicated because the object model, which is a topic for our next course coming up, the object model here actually is relatively complex, and honestly requires time spent here to really figure out exactly which objects are appropriate for which reports. If I just hit the search button here, this will search against all the objects that are currently in the Ops Manager database. And as you can see here, all these items may or may not necessarily be appropriate for the report that you're trying to generate. And so if I'm doing an availability report, for example, does it make sense for me to then do it against the column types, which is an extension type class here? Probably not. Or a cylinder, or the data access service here. There's a lot of different objects that really don't make any sense for the type of availability report that we're looking for. This is, as I said, the most complex part of actually working with Operations Manager is in trying to figure out which object in which class makes sense for the information you're trying to gather. One way in which you can simplify things is by sorting by class here. And I just happen to know in working with this that all the way down at the bottom, we have our Windows computer objects right here. So these are those Windows computer objects for really all the machines that currently exist here in the Ops Manager infrastructure. So DC, MGMT, My Desktop, and so on. Let me hit the Shift button here to select all of these objects, these Windows computer objects, and hit OK. I'm looking here for downtime that's associated with, for example, unplanned maintenance. So just this particular type of downtime. If I've got the right object in the right object class here, and I run the report, I should very quickly then see the right information then for what I'm looking for. So you can see here that, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 7 of the 8 machines here are currently showing 100% up, with the one machine right here, rdcb.company.pri, having an availability tracker right here being gray. So even though it says here the uptime is 100%, this green bar here lets me know that perhaps I'm just not monitoring the right parts of this machine. Again, later on as we start installing more management packs, we should start seeing better data here because of the monitors that are created by those MPs. And so this gives me a good feel now for this report and the information that it provides. And I can, because of the way the report's generated, then click even further into the details for the availability time, the object monitor availability, and so on. So really the best thing to do here is really to just start clicking around to try to see exactly what these reports can generate for you. And as I said, the hardest part really is going to be, if we come back here under View and Parameters, to really figure out exactly which objects make sense for the reports that you're trying to generate. Let's go through a second example here. Let me close this down and then take a look at another report here in the generic report library. This is one that will become useful in that next course as we start talking about generating overrides for tuning the individual monitors and rules that exist there in the management packs we've installed. These overrides, as I've mentioned lightly already, are the way later on that we'll go through making sure that a monitor isn't too noisy or setting something to critical when it really isn't critical for our environment. One of the hardest parts, though, about overrides is really figuring out where you've configured them once you've configured them. And so this report here does a really good job of identifying all the overrides that exist in an Ops Manager infrastructure. And so, again, let's go through here from today to yesterday, or from yesterday to today, and the mountain time and the management group here. Let's then take a look at the overrides that exist in the management packs that I currently have installed here. These are the out-of-box management packs. If I hit run here, this will show me the long list of overrides that already exist here in the infrastructure today. And so again, we'll talk more about how these really work in the course coming up, but for now, this is a great report example for helping you identify, once you've configured those overrides, where they are, and then what the new configuration will be, what the new value is right here. So I will leave it to you to click around even further to identify just what reports are useful to you. For now, though, these are the reports that you get with those management packs that currently are installed here into the system. Now, one final task here that should seem a little self-evident is the ability to then schedule and deliver the reports. Most of this is something you'll probably figure out on your own, but there is just a couple of things I want to show you. Let's say, for example, that back to our availability view right here, this is the first report that we generated a second ago. Let me choose to, rather than open the report, instead to schedule the report. Let's call this our availability report here. And when we generate it, we have 3 different options for how we'll deliver it to its users. We can choose a file share, an email, and the null delivery provider right down here. The file share, if you recall back in the configuration of SSRS, uses that Active Directory account that we configured for putting this into a file share somewhere. When you configure this, you'll need to identify what the file name and path will be, so obviously how you get to that file share, what format it'll use, PDF or many of the other different formats that exist, what the write mode will be, what file extension will be used, and then the username and password, or whether you want to use that file share account. Once you've done that, you can then schedule the report right here with the second item here. Let me choose also, if I hit cancel here, to show you if I do schedule this, I can also schedule it for an email delivery option as well. So again, here's our availability report and our delivery method right down here being email. For this, we'll have the obvious usual email settings like who it goes to and CC and BCC and who the reply to will be, and then the usual things about how we want it rendered and what our subject and any comments will be. Once we've configured that, then that also can be scheduled with the next item there. Let me show you then that if I change this from email down to our null delivery provider, we have quite a bit less in terms of the configurations that we require. This null delivery provider is perhaps the least evident of the three delivery methods that exist. This is used to preload your report server cache with ready-to-view reports. It's not really designed for users with individual subscriptions, but rather for you, the administrator, in a data-driven subscription to improve the whole reporting server performance by preloading that report server cache with the information that you've gathered here. As you might imagine, as we start getting more into production with more servers and more data and a bigger database, the generation of these reports will begin to take more time. There's just more effort involved. And so preloading the cache with a series of reports that you know you're going to be looking for can be easily done here by setting them up under a schedule with this null delivery provider. I also do this so I can show you what the schedule looks like. Here is where you'll actually identify when that report will be generated. And so do I do it once or hourly or daily or weekly or so on, when it's effective beginning and then when it expires. Also, here are the parameters, effectively those parameters that you defined for the report. This should look very similar to how we initially configured those parameters when we were running that report there in interactive mode. So you've seen this before here when we first went through the configuration of that availability report. I won't finish this here. We're not going to set these up for any kind of schedule, but this is the process you can go through for then scheduling and delivering reports to your users as they require them. Perhaps my use of the term mundanities for this second half of the content in this course was a bit overstated. The reports that an ops manager infrastructure can generate can be really helpful for users that don't want to have to click into the operations console to gather that information. Really, anybody other than yourself and your team who requires access to this information, oftentimes it's better to give them a report than to have them try to figure out where in the console the information lies. And so what have we talked about in this module? We've gone through the installation and configuration of both SSRS and then the SCOM reporting server components that layer over the top. With that and the appropriate amount of time then elapsed, we went through the generation and the running of those reports, as well as the scheduling and delivering of reports, so that we can provide that to users whenever they require them. Coming up next, we continue this conversation on maybe not the mundanities, but definitely the everyday care and feeding of an ops manager infrastructure. In the next topic, we'll go through the installation of audit collection services, which is an optional add-on for gathering audit-related information across the machines in your data center. ACS can obviously generate a lot of data. There's a lot of audit data out there on every computer in your data center. And so it may not necessarily be appropriate for every implementation. But for those where it is, that installation and configuration of ACS can provide an easier access to all that auditing information when a security situation or an auditor requires it. That conversation on the installation and configuration of ACS is the topic for our next module coming up. Next up is our installation and configuration of audit collection services into this Ops Manager infrastructure. And although the actual next text finish that makes up that install is relatively trivial, it is actually here in this ACS installation where the planning can almost be more involved than what you might have done with that original management server implementation. Indeed, installing ACS does require quite a bit of planning. Number one, because you have to figure out exactly what it is you want to audit. What this solution does is effectively just gather the contents of your security logs off of the machines where you have Ops Manager agents installed. And defining exactly what will exist in those logs is something that requires an understanding of what your security requirements dictate. And so, although we'll spend more of our time here talking about the actual installation and configuration, as you go through planning, even whether or not ACS makes sense for your SCOM infrastructure, well, you might also want to take a step back and think about what exactly it is that you do want to audit. We'll spend some time here in this module talking about the planning for that ACS implementation, as well as what different kinds of settings exist there for configuring Windows auditing. I do here, for the second of these two, want to talk just a minute about the 9 major categories that have existed for many different OS versions now. These 9 different categories of auditing and exactly what it is that they do. Although these 9 categories have been around for what I guess would be decades now, I think it's worth taking one step back to really understand exactly what each of the categories can provide. What kinds of data actually will then exist there in the logs when you turn each of these on. Further, the gathering of all this information is going to create a database that can get exceptionally large in size. If you think about just the total contents of your security logs and then assimilating all those security logs together into a single database, you really have to plan for exactly how much database or how big that database is going to be before you ever start turning these things on and sucking all this content into a single location. It's worth mentioning also that many of these security-oriented data collection solutions oftentimes don't follow the same kinds of administrative architectures that you tend to find for other IT solutions. In many organizations, there is a separate group of people who that group of people is responsible for monitoring the logs. And so segregating out what would be your classic Ops Manager implementation from what you gather there with ACS is yet another conversation entirely. We'll talk very lightly about that segregation and how you can implement that segregation, although we'll spend most of our time here on what is considered the consolidated implementation, so putting everything together into a single database server. From there, we'll get into the installation and enabling of ACS. As I said, the process is relatively simple. There's just a couple of gotchas there for getting it enabled. The deploying then of ACS reporting is one task, though, that requires some command line work and may not be immediately obvious right out of the gate. So we'll go through that deployment there of the reports to our reporting server that we configured just earlier ago, and then go through managing ACS, the command line tool for managing its configuration, and then taking a look at the reports that you can now generate once you start collecting all that information into its database. In terms then of planning for that ACS implementation, one of the first things we need to do is identify some vocabulary. Some of the items that we're used to thinking of in the Ops Manager infrastructure have slightly different names here when we're talking about them in the context of ACS. First up is our ACS collector, which in the old Ops Manager terms is really just another management server. We call this an ACS collector because even though it exists there on a management server and you install the ACS collector functionality onto a management server, in that segregated configuration, should you end up separating out the rest of Operations Manager from ACS, although you will install ACS onto a management server, that segregation really isolates the collector functions then from what's being gathered there by the rest of Ops Manager. So at least here in this module, as we're referring to ACS, the ACS collector function that exists there on a management server, this then works with an ACS database, which is yet another SQL database that exists there in the environment. In that combined architecture, that can be the same SQL server, a different database obviously, but the same SQL server, or it can be its own SQL database on a different SQL server. If you're planning on separating these out, you'll have an entirely different SQL server with its own SQL database and all the necessary separate permissioning involved. Most commonly then, these collectors and databases are then matched together into pairs. So you'll find a collector and a database paired together to create this instance of the server side for ACS. Those pairs can leverage high availability, so you have multiple collectors or multiple databases in a clustered configuration, but as I said, they tend to be paired together to create that ACS infrastructure on the server side that is then directed to, or the data is then directed to, by what is our ACS forwarder. Now, don't get really overwhelmed here with the idea of an ACS forwarder. The only thing an ACS forwarder is some additional code that's there on each SCOM client for directing all that security log data there through the collector and to an ACS database. The actual ACS forwarding code actually exists as part of the agent install that we've already done here so far. There is a separate step involved with enabling the forwarding functionality, so there isn't any additional work that's required on the agent side other than simply turning it on. But be aware here, if you do see this additional terminology, these are the terms that are used when we start adding in ACS into our existing Ops Manager infrastructure. I do want to tread relatively lightly here on the task of capacity planning for ACS, in that actually figuring out how big your database needs to be and how many resources are required for ensuring the database has enough performance is a really advanced task, I think more so than we can talk about here in this course. I do want to point your attention, however, to one website where Microsoft provides some details about the capacity planning activity, essentially trying to figure out if you have enough hardware for all that content that's coming in. If you really think about the amount of content, as I said, in each individual security log, it is entirely possible for you to associate a server that just simply can't keep up with the load. One way in which you can identify that you don't have a server that can keep up with the load is right here and taking a look at the collector queue. This ACS collector queue and the values, the performance values like what you can see here, are what determines when a collector needs to shut down the receipt of additional information, of additional data coming in order to process what it has there in queue. You can see here that these are registry values here. There's our maximum queue length, our backoff threshold, and our disconnect threshold. These refer to the maximum number of events that can queue in memory while waiting for the database to actually get them written. And then when will the ACS database stop accepting more information or just simply disconnect the client because it can't keep up with the load? These are adjustable configurations here. If you find your hardware may not be able to keep up with the load, you may need to adjust that backoff threshold or even your disconnect threshold. But it also may mean that you don't have enough hardware in place to support actually gathering all that information. So this is one in arrears way that you could identify you don't have enough hardware to support the needs of your ACS collector. There are some other items down here in terms of sizing the memory for your ACS collector, and then also the database right down here at the bottom for exactly how much memory and what size of database and what performance characteristics you need for that database. As I said, this process is relatively complex. There is some science to it, but there's also some art to it as well. So I'll direct your attention again here to this web page on Audit Collection Services Capacity Planning to give you the metrics that Microsoft provides to at least get you started. I do also want to address that security partitioning configuration that we won't explore here in much detail other than identifying that it is possible. As you can see here, I have on the left-hand side a more classic Ops Manager infrastructure, and I have this sort of dotted line over there to the right-hand side where I've got another ACS database and reporting server. This partitioning of the ACS functionality from the rest of an Ops Manager infrastructure is something that can become necessary if your organization indeed requires the separation of audit data from its traditional administrators, so having a separate group of auditors that manage the content there. In a combined configuration where everything exists on a small number of servers and no partitioning exists, data starts obviously there on the Ops Manager agent, which in our case here is the ACS forwarder. That data gets forwarded there to our management server, which ends up in the management database. And then from there, the information about those audits gets gathered as a function of our reporting server. This is the environment that we're about to configure here, all on that same set of servers with no partitioning of permissions or users. But it is entirely possible with a little bit of extra work, and I'll direct your attentions to TechNet to identify the extra couple of steps that are necessary to complete this partitioning. But there isn't entirely a different way in which you can set up this whole ACS infrastructure, where data still starts there on the individual Ops Manager client. So the ACS forwarder, aka the Ops Manager client, then directs its information to an ACS collector, which then crosses the partitioning boundary there, storing its information into the ACS database. It's the separate permissioning, the different set of ACLs on that ACS database that then allow your auditors in a separate organization to then gather information about what's been gathered there through a separate ACS reporting server. This separation ensures that your administrators can't perform some nefarious action that they can then clear their tracks by wiping out the contents of the database. Having a separate group is just a check and a balance on the extra power that's granted to those administrators with elevated privileges. As I said, the actual click-by-click for this configuration is something we won't be talking about here, but I'll direct your attentions to TechNet for is really just a couple of extra steps that are required and separate servers to create this partitioned environment. Although our next step is technically a configuration step, it's also a planning step as well. That is the configuration of Windows auditing, which is entirely an activity that occurs outside the purview of Operations Manager. I'm back here on my desktop where I've got a copy of the GPMC up, and I'm here taking a look at the default domain policy as well as the default domain controllers policy. Let's take a look here at the configuration of auditing using the default domain policy here as our example. I've already gone through and actually made some policy configuration changes here so that we can take a look at a sample starting point for the kinds of audit data that you may want to incorporate there into the ACS infrastructure that you're creating. Here under Windows Settings and then Security Settings, and right down here under Local Policies is the audit policy that I've configured here for the domain. I put this here in default domain, although you could create your own separate custom GPOs if you wanted to. I put it here in default domain because ostensibly every machine in the environment probably should have the same policy settings configured. I'll leave this here on the screen for just an extra second or two because this is a common starting point for auditing in really any Active Directory domain, where we audit for success and failure of account login events, account management, login events, and policy changes. We only look for failures there for directory service accesses and privileged uses, and then successes there for system events. Notice also that we don't actually monitor for object access and then for process tracking, although you could turn them on if you should so choose. Those two items tend to dramatically increase the number of items in the log and really can sometimes just generate a lot of noise without all that much extra benefit. I'll show you here that in addition to the audit policy right down here, we may also want to take a look at the event log policies as well in determining a maximum security log size for each machine. This is here only to ensure that we don't fill up a log. By setting this here to 16 megabytes and then setting the retention method for as needed, overriding them as needed, this ensures that the collection of all that information won't fill up the disk here of these servers when we turn on this policy. It is worth mentioning also that if I take a look not here at the default domain policy, but the default domain controllers policy, that one slight configuration difference exists right down here. This domain controllers policy is different from default domain in that default domain is not respected by domain controllers, and the default domain controllers policy is only respected by DCs. Down here under event log, I'll show you that we've actually just added an extra 0 here to the 16 megs to make it 160 megs for the maximum security log size. And we're still rotating the security logs right here as needed. This is a good starting point. This may not necessarily be your configuration, but again, this is a good starting point for making sure that you can capture all the extra items that exist here once we start turning on auditing. Again, these are the same values here, but when we start turning on auditing for all the different authentications against this domain controller. I do want to spend some time here while we're discussing this, talking a bit about the different kinds of auditing settings that exist on a Windows machine. These 9 auditing categories, as I said in the introduction, have been around for a lot of generations of the OS at this point. And so the information that they provide really doesn't change all that much from OS to OS. There is some change, but for the most part, as I said, they've been around for a really long period of time. The hard part here is figuring out exactly what kinds of information you get from each auditing category. So let's take a minute here and just take a look at what exactly each of these categories, the kinds of audit data each category can provide. For account logon events, this one's actually kind of complex here. Account logon events will audit each instance of a user logging into or off a computer from which this computer validates the account. I really don't like that terminology. But what it says is that if you are the computer that's validating the account, if you're the one performing the authentication, then you'll actually have an account logon event that exists there in your audit log or in your security log. So if this is an Active Directory domain login, that account logon event will exist on the domain controller security log. If this is a local login, that logon event will exist then on the local device's security log. And so where that event actually ends up existing as an account logon event will be very different depending on if that user logs on locally or logs on with their Active Directory account. This is different from down here at the bottom. I know I'm skipping down here, but this is different from logon events. So logon events audit each instance of a user logging into or out of a device. This is not necessarily where the account authentication occurs. This is just the actual logon itself. I've repeated the second paragraph here to kind of stand in contrast with the third paragraph. So again, an account logon event is where the authentication occurs. The logon event occurs where the logon occurs. So logons that use a domain account will generate a login or logoff event on the workstation or server, and in addition to that, generate an account logon event on the domain controller. Again, these two are quite different, but this has to do with the location where the logon occurs. as opposed to who is authenticating that user when the logon occurs. Now, if these two are arguably the most difficult to keep separate in your mind, even I get them confused from time to time, the rest of these are almost self-explanatory. So account management will audit account management events, like adding and removing users from groups, creating group accounts or deleting them, changing passwords, and so on. Your directory service access will audit the event of a user accessing an Active Directory object where there's some ECL that's been applied. Curious here is that there is actually only one directory service access event, which is identical to the object access security event. It's event 566, which is a generic object operation took place. So there's not a lot of data granularity here, but there's not a lot of granularity that's being advertised as well. You're only really advertising a category of when a user accesses the directory service, and that's exactly the data that you're getting back. Object access here is one that, as you noticed earlier, is not typically turned on by default. And that's the case because every time you touch an object, a file, a folder, a registry key, a printer, anything that has an ACL on it, you'll get an object access entry, or sometimes many object access entries. And those have a tendency to really fill up the log. There are circumstances where you do need to turn this on, like if you're troubleshooting a problem, perhaps a permissions problem. But for the most part, this tends to be turned off, except in those situations where you need to have it turned on. Our next category then, policy change, obviously audits changes to policies like user rights assessment policies, audit policies, and trust policies. Privilege use audits instances of users exercising their user rights. These are the actual user rights, not the privileges that you've defined there in ACLs, but the rights that they have, like act as a member of the OS or back up this machine and so on. Process tracking is one of those we don't tend to turn on by default because it's really meant for deep level troubleshooting. So really digging deep into the traces of what's going on the OS. But this will audit detailed tracking information for program activation, process exits, duplication of handles, indirect object accesses, really more developer-oriented type things there on the system. The last of these then is system events, which we tend to track then the successful system events because these are things like restarting or shutting down the computer, or anytime there's a major change there to the system security or the security log. You want to know when someone successfully changes a configuration for a security log. So this short list of descriptions should give you a feel for why we set up the auditing configuration with success and failure audits, just like I showed you just a second ago. Obviously, that is just a starting point. If you have other configurations, you can turn them on for your particular environment. But that is kind of a early practice or a best practice to get you started for the kinds of events that are usually useful for your typical auditor. Now, I actually turned on auditing last night, and so there are a series of auditing events currently in logs for all these servers. That also gives group policy some opportunity there to change the configuration on these machines. You can see now that back here on mgmt.company.pri, our next step then is to install the components into Ops Manager for making our management server now an ACS collector. Let me minimize this and show you that I've already brought up here the setup routine for Ops Manager, where down here we can install audit collection services right here. This is your usual next finish installation. As I said, this is probably the unexciting part of what we're configuring here. We will be creating a new database on our SQL server, which will be the Ops Manager AC database there. This will go through creating an ODBC DSN on this machine and configuring the database as appropriate. There on our remote machine, which we'll configure right here, our machine name being SQL. If we have an instance name, we can include it right here, and then here's what the database name will be, Operations Manager AC. Let me choose Next here to then go through the database authentication screen where we can choose Windows or SQL authentication. For our environment here, we already have all the necessary components set up to use existing Active Directory domain accounts, so Windows authentication can be a good configuration for this setting here. In that segregated environment, where you have a separate SQL server that may not even necessarily be part of your Active Directory domain, SQL authentication can provide that username and password. As long as you don't use the SA username and password, you can use a separate one for actually setting up this database and doing all the necessary configuration. We will continue to do, as I said here, the combined configuration, so we'll use Windows authentication as the mechanism for authenticating to the database. We will use also the default data and log file directories in a segregated configuration. You might put this on a separate volume with different permissioning, again, to separate out the admins from your auditors and who can see what. But we'll use the same default data and log file directories here. What is our retention schedule then? How many days of events do we want to then restore into our database? The value here will be determined exactly by what your security policy is. So someone will probably tell you how many days you need to retain this information in the database. That may be 14, or it may be 30, 60, or 90 days. It all depends on what's in those requirements that are being levied upon you. More importantly here for our configuration, at least in terms of how you're setting this up for the rest of your environment, is right up here, the local hour of the day to perform daily database maintenance. The process of doing database maintenance, the re-indexing and all the other magic that goes on under the covers, is something that should occur during the lowest point of event generation in your day. It should also not be co-timed with other major activities that could occur there on the database. A common item here is, for example, database backups. You don't want re-indexing to occur at the same time that you're performing backups. So make sure you set this at a time which doesn't conflict with your backup activity or any other major maintenance activities that could be going on this machine. I will select 2 a.m. and 14 here as the default values, and then for our timestamp format, set it to UTC. I choose UTC here only in case we have machines that are crossing time zones, and so I map everything back to UTC to ensure unified time across all the machines. Otherwise, the timestamps of the database, as you can see here, are stored and adjusted to the local time there on the database server. I'll choose next here and next to go through installing ACS onto this machine. You'll see here, here's my SQL Server. Let me choose OK to log into the SQL Server here. And now we're beginning the process of installing this ACS component here onto this machine. You can see here it actually doesn't take all that long to complete. Once installed, I mentioned that one step here in the process is not entirely obvious, and that is the enabling then of ACS on the machines that make up this Ops Manager environment. Let me flip back over here to my desktop where I've got a copy of the Ops Manager console here loaded up. And the place where you actually locate the enabling for these agents is not entirely evident here as you start clicking around here in the interface. The place where you find it actually, if we scroll down here, is found under the folder for Operations Manager. Right here under the folder, we have a couple places we need to enable then ACS for first our management servers and gateways, and then second for the agents that talk then to those management servers. First up here are our management servers. I'm going to take a look here at the state of our management servers. And then here under the management server state right here is where we'll find the health service task titled Enable Audit Collection right here. I just simply need to run this for each of the management servers first. Let me then run this task right here, and once the task completes, which will take a second or two, then we can continue this process over there on each individual agent. You will want to first complete this task on all of your management servers, on any gateways then that you have, and give it a period or two to let it do its background activities. Once it's completed then, you can continue the process by coming right up here to Agent Details, and then right down here, Agents by Version. For each of the agents that you have in the environment, let's do our SQL Server here, you'll see right here, Enable Audit Collection, and just like before, you'll repeat the process here for each of the individual agents you have in the environment. I will go through here before we get to the next clip then and complete this process on all the other agents that we have here in the infrastructure. Installing the ACS collector components is only one step here in the process. The other half is to upload then the reports that we can later use for actually looking at the data that we're now collecting. That process involves actually some command line work over on our report server itself. That's our SQL server here in this environment, where you can see I've brought up a copy of the DVD ISO. So this is a SCOM 2016 DVD media. And then I've also gone through here on the root of C, I've created a new folder here called ACS. It's an empty folder here right now because the process to upload this content requires you to first manually copy some content from that DVD ISO to your local machine. That content here is in the root, again, of the DVD ISO in Report Models and then ACS. From there, I can copy everything I see here over to this local location. And this content includes this reporting config.exe and config.exe.config file here. This is actually the executable that will upload all that content to our reporting server, but it itself is wrapped by another command here called upload auditreports.cmd. Let me show you exactly what we're attempting to do here. Let me bring up a copy of Internet Explorer here and go to https and then sql.company.pri/reports. This is the location where those reports are actually being generated from. And if I go here, you'll see the list of reports that currently exist here on our SSRS instance. We are going to upload the ECS reports here into this instance so that we can then take a look at the data we're now collecting then from all those different agents. So let me copy this command line here from my notes over here to the right. This will be upload audit reports SQL. This is our SQL server, sql.company.pri. If you do have an instance name here, you'll need to do /instance name for the first parameter. And then HTTP sql.company.pri/report server. So not reports, but report server. We are here addressing then the service as opposed to the actual report website. And then :/ECS right here. I should mention also that if you do have an instance, you'll want to punch in here the $instance name for the value here after report server if you're using a separate instance. We are not here, so we can do just this command as it exists right here. This process will go through uploading those reports that exist there in that location, and after a minute or two, we should then be able to make use of the reports that now exist or will shortly exist there on our reporting server. Once everything's installed, we have only two other items to really discuss. One is how to manage now your ECS implementation, which is entirely command line based. There's just an executable that you'll find there on your management server for controlling its configuration, and then also to take a look at the reports that we've just generated. Let's start first with that single command line, which does really all the configuration here for ECS once installed. Let me flip from our SQL server over here to our management server. This is MGMT, where we installed the ACS collector components. And as part of that install here in Windows System 32 Security, we now have a new folder here called ADT Server. In this folder, what we're looking for is the adtadmin.exe file right here. This is the command line tool that you'll use for furthering any configuration that can be required. So let me clear the screen here and do adtadmin /? to show you the very long list of options that exist. Let me scroll up here. These are just how you define what you're directing or targeting these instructions towards. But right up here are how you go about then adjusting the configuration of your ACS infrastructure. So what kind of stats do you want to get? Do you want to print the statistics of a running ADT server? Do you want to get or then change the HUCL query that is determining exactly what kinds of events are ending up in your database? It is this HUCL query that constrains exactly what kinds of entries end up in that database and is one that you can use actually to really limit the amount of data coming in. There is the abilities also to set up groups. This whole process of setting up groups really is only necessary in extremely large environments. You can list them, add them, delete them, and update them right down here. You can also, right here with partitions, getting and setting partitions, this is the location where you could adjust the retention values for the database. There are a lot of other just configurations here that you probably won't find yourself using all that often. So this ADT admin tool really is your only point of configuration for ACS once you have it installed. Let us then take a look at the more graphical orientation for everything that we've configured here so far. And that's back here on my desktop, where let me go ahead and restart then the operations console so we can take a look at the new reports that exist there in the reporting pane. Once this is installed, let's go down here to our reporting pane right down here and see that we should now, if I click correctly, we should now have access to several new reports that exist here in the list up here in the upper left. Let me minimize this, and right here are our new audit reports that exist. So these are what are available, again, right out of the box. If you later need to go through and make your own custom reports, here are the two templates that are available, the audit report template and the audit 5 report template, which the difference here is whether or not you're collecting all 22 values for these audits or whether you're constraining down to just, I believe, a limit of 5, which is why it's called Audit 5 here. Obviously, the Audit 5 report template, because it gathers less information, will run faster. The report just takes less time to run. Here are all the reports that have been installed. And in fact, let's pick a report here, I don't know, event counts by computer, to see exactly what we're getting now out of these new ACS reports. For this, let's poke at one of our machines here, company/MGMT, and then the start date being Thursday. So what kind of information will we get here about the kinds of events for this particular machine? We have 18% of event ID 4627s and 13% of 4648s. These are the event counts that exist here for this machine. And I could go on with all the different reports and the information that they provide, but really it's your job at this point to identify what kinds of reports are valuable for you as a security professional, putting on your security IT pro hat, or for your auditors and taking a look at the data that's being collected. It's worth also mentioning that if you don't want to give those auditors access to the operations console, or if you've configured that segregated infrastructure where they don't even have access to the operations console, the other way in which you can provide access happens here through the reporting services website. We looked at this already earlier when we were configuring our SQL Server just a minute ago. And you can see here that we now actually have a new folder here for those audit reports, which include all the reports that currently exist there in the operations console, but in this case viewed with, I don't know, just a very slightly different view here using web services. So this becomes yet another way in which you can provide access to the auditors who need to see this content that you're collecting. As with a lot of stuff here with Operations Manager, the installation is perhaps less exciting than the planning that's required. What have we talked about in this module? We've gone through exactly what you need to prepare for before you ever even decide if ACS is a useful addition to your Ops Manager infrastructure. We talked also about the different Windows auditing categories and which ones you may want to set up at first so that you're gathering the right kinds of information when you turn on these ACS agents. We then went through the installation and enabling of ACS on our server and our client side and deployed ACS reporting. With that, we took a look at that ADT admin tool, along with all the new reports that are available for seeing what's going on inside our environment. Coming up next, we continue with this theme of security and focusing on the users and user roles of people who will be accessing this Ops Manager infrastructure. In that next module, we'll go through the configuration of user roles so that you can define exactly what kinds of visibility and actions a person should have, as well as looking at the run as accounts there in Ops Manager, defining a special account that has special access to perform special tasks. That conversation on the users and user roles in our Ops Manager infrastructure is the topic for our next module coming up. I believe it's the case with all these learning paths that at least at some point there is this requirement for a perfunctory discussion on users and user roles. Really, every technology we in IT are charged with managing requires the distribution of rights and privileges to different users. And to be perfectly frank, in most situations, the module on users and user roles for any other learning path is often full of content that's really self-explanatory. There are some situations here where that's the case. However, there are also some areas here that are not entirely obvious when you first take a look at the administrative consoles that you have. And so here in this module, this is perhaps the very first of the user roles modules I've put together that has some really interesting content in it here to this point. Here in this module, we are going to talk about the different ways in which you can configure user roles and the kind of somewhat strange way in which Operations Manager makes available your abilities to determine who gets access to what. That process starts by taking a look at what are termed user role profiles, essentially a set of pre-generated master categories for the different kinds of roles that you'll create. There are and will always be 5 different profiles that are the starting point for the creation of any user role, and knowing which of the profiles you should use to start the generation of that role is really most of the difficulty here. We then, after understanding what the profiles are intended to accomplish, will take a look at actually configuring some user roles using those profiles. I say that figuring out the profile first is important because different profiles offer different items there in the wizard for creating each user role. And there are a couple, 2 or 3 of them that are most important of the ones that you'll see. Once we've configured our user role here, we have a sample user with our Donna Jones account that will give access to certain areas there inside of the operations console. One such location is My Workspace, which is a place where they can take all the different views they have access to and consolidate them down into those that are of most importance to them. Being able to see the content there in the operations console obviously requires access to the ops console, which then itself requires the installation of that piece of code onto their machine. Yet many people that are outside of the operator role may not necessarily require a full unfettered access to the operations console and all the other stuff that it provides. And so for that reason, Ops Manager provides this web console, a very lightweight console that's designed really for reading of information. If you have users that don't need to make changes to your operations infrastructure, that aren't authors or advanced operators that will configure overrides, it's likely that the content there in the web console may be sufficient for their needs. And so we'll talk here about what the web console can do. We'll explore through it just a bit because we've only really seen the front page here at this point. And then from there, we'll move into really the second half of the content here, which moves away from user roles, those that are tied to actual human beings, and more towards what are termed run-as accounts. There are a series of run-as accounts that are generated for you during the initial installation, but as you go through the further configuration, setting up tasks and other items that are perhaps scheduled, there may become the need to create other run-as accounts that are allowed to perform certain tasks. These run-as accounts allow a human being to perform a task with elevated privileges, but without giving them all the privileges that that elevation may engender. And so if you have need for a user to perform a task where the task requires admin rights, but you don't want to give the user admin rights, these run-as accounts kind of sit in the middle, allowing the user to perform the task, but without giving them the full unfettered access of administrator privileges. Our conversation here on configuring user roles really needs to start by taking a look at the 5 different user profiles or user role profiles that are the starting point for the generation of any user roles. But before we get into the PowerPoint where I explain what these different profiles are, I think it's important for us to understand where in the interface we're actually talking about here. I am back here on my desktop and I'm taking a look at the Operations Manager console here under the Administration pane. And if I scroll all the way down to the bottom, here under Security is User Roles. And I believe we've actually been here before where we took a look at the contents of these different roles and then the profiles associated with each role. So right here, for example, is the profile, the operator profile, and then sub to that is a role that's been created associated with that operator profile. I've told you that there are 5 major profiles that you can create roles from. There's another one here for administrator, but you don't actually create additional roles based off of that profile. The 5 profiles start here if you right-click and choose New User Profile, and you can see all 5 of these that exist here. This profile, or the differences between these profiles are important because which one of these you actually choose begins the process of defining exactly what that user should be able to do. So before we get into actually configuring these, let's rather spend a minute just talking about the 5 different profiles and how each relates to a different kind of permissioning that you may want to deploy out to a particular user or group. As I said here, we have 5. There's the operator, the read-only operator, advanced operator, a report operator, and author profile type. Let's dig then into each individually to get a feel for what they or how they actually go about then constraining those accesses for different users. Let's start here with the operator user profile, which includes a set of privileges that are designed for users who need access to alerts, views, and tasks. And anytime you create a role based off of this profile, it's going to give your members, the users, the abilities to interact with alerts, execute tasks, and access those views there in the operations console. This is important because the operator role, very different from the read-only operator role, which we'll talk about here next, has additional privileges to resolve alerts, to execute tasks, and to do things that a read-only operator would not be able to do. A read-only operator is fairly self-explanatory in that the read-only operator profile includes only those privileges for users that need read-only access, just the abilities to view alerts and to view the contents there in any of the views that you create. And so a role that you create based off of this profile will grant any users those abilities to just view the contents and not execute a task and not resolve an alert or any of the other action-oriented items that exist there in the console. Now, out of all the users there in your infrastructure, these 2 are perhaps the user profiles that you'll find yourself deploying maybe the most. There is an advanced operator user profile here that gives just a bit more access to perform just a bit more tasks there inside of the console. The advanced operator is designed to add a specific additional privilege for users who need to access what is termed here limited tweaking of monitoring configuration. What this specifically relates to is granting a user the abilities to configure an override for any of the rules or monitors that have been configured then on one of the machines or other objects that are within their sphere of influence. So if you have a user who has the need to see information and also execute tasks and resolve alerts, but also to tune the experience, to actually make changes to thresholds and adjust exactly when information gets reported on, it's the advanced operator role that you'll want to give them access to, or become the starting point for the granting there of their access. Now, the last of these operators here is the report operator, which obviously has to do with the abilities to then view reports. The report operator profile includes those privileges for users who need access to reports, and because reports are generally a generate and then view sort of experience, most of the access here has to do with exactly that, being able to view reports and then kick off reports when necessary. Now, one important difference here with the report operator role is that because most of the report accesses are not actually handled there inside of the ops manager infrastructure, when we later go to configure a report operator, you'll find that it's actually a multi-step experience. It involves first creating that role there inside of Operations Manager, and then really copying and pasting the contents of that role over into SSRS to then later apply the actual privileges for viewing the report. So I'll show you how this works. It's actually kind of non-obvious the first time or two, but is relatively simple in copying out a long string of digits and then pasting it over there into SSRS. Now, the last of these is the one that you'll probably find yourself applying the least to different users in your infrastructure. The author profile includes even more privileges than your advanced operator, in that the author profile has the abilities to now author additional monitoring configurations. These are tasks that we have not done here to this point. We'll do those in that course coming up. But if you give someone an author privilege, that gives them additional capabilities to then create, edit, and delete any kind of monitoring configuration there in the authoring pane, not just in the monitoring pane, but in the authoring pane. So this is creating tasks and creating rules and monitors and views within their configured scope. So you do actually constrain down which areas they have the abilities to configure those monitors. Any individual to which you're configuring an author role needs to have the knowledge of how to actually create these monitoring configurations, which is in and of itself a non-trivial activity. So you won't find yourself doing this that often because the process to create rules and monitors is something that not a lot of individuals actually know how to do. It's worth mentioning also that for convenience, or really it's almost necessary, the author may also need to have an advanced operator privilege to perform the other types of things that an advanced operator should be able to do. So advanced operator focuses its attentions there on the monitoring pane, whereas authoring has everything to do with the authoring pane. So again, we have not yet talked about the authoring activity and all the extra stuff that's necessary to author additional monitors and tasks and rules and whatnot. But when it does come time to extend out those privileges to other individuals, this is the user profile you would use. Now back over here on my desktop, again taking a look at the Ops Manager console, let's go through the creation of a couple of user roles here for a user, or a group of users who may have special constrained access to certain types of data. Let's say, for example, in this infrastructure, I'll bring up here Active Directory users and computers. I have a set of auditors here. These auditors have need to access the ACS components that already exist now here in our infrastructure. These auditors are, if you look at the members here, my Donna Jones account right here. So I have one user in one group that needs to have the constrained access to just the ACS-oriented data that exists here in the infrastructure. This is an example of one such situation where you may just want to constrain that down to just certain areas there in the monitoring pane right here. Here under the monitoring pane, we have all the different stuff that we've been working with here so far, but these auditors don't have need to have that deep level understanding if databases are up, if servers are up or down, if networks are working or not. And so all they really need to know is right here, the Microsoft Audit Collection Services view right down here. This contains all the information that these particular users need. And so out of all of these, I just want to limit their view here to the collector and forwarder information that exists here underneath Microsoft Audit Collection Services. Let us now do this for our Donna Jones user. I'll come back here under Administration and let me configure now a new user role using the appropriate profile, which in this case would be a standard operator. The read-only operator and the advanced operator, the process to configure this new role is fundamentally the same. So if you know how to do it for operator, you know how to do it more or less for the other items as well. Let me choose operator here, and let's call this user role name, let's call this auditors. And then for our user role members, let's add in the auditors global group right here. It is generally a good idea for you to use global groups here as opposed to individual usernames. That's just kind of a best practice here for creating these user roles. So I'll set this here in auditors so our Donna Jones account has access. We now need to identify where in the tree we want to provide access for this group of auditors. By default here, you can see every item here. The monitoring objects in all these groups is available by default, but we don't want that for the auditors. They don't have need to access everything here. Rather, what they're looking for is all of our audit collection services stuff right here. This group for audit collection services should include all the necessary information to allow access to the views that we saw just a second ago. And if I scroll down here just to confirm, yep, I don't see any other ACS related information here, so this will be the group to which I want to provide access for those auditors. Let me take a look here at the next button. If I choose that, I can choose which tasks those users should be able to perform. All tasks can either be automatically approved here or only those that are explicitly added here to the group. If we sort by management pack, we can see which tasks are related to the different kinds of management packs and then the different kinds of content that should be associated to this group of auditors. So we're not interested in core monitoring or the network management library, but rather right up here, disabling, enabling, and starting audit collection are those that are in the Microsoft Audit Collection Services management pack here. I don't actually know if these are the right ones for my auditors, but for the purposes of this example here, let's assume that we are aware that they have need to disable, enable, and start audit collection on various machines. Let me choose OK here, and then Next. And then here I then identify which dashboards and views those users should have access to. By default, they have access to all the different dashboards and views, again, that are constrained by their group scope. But let me limit things here to set them down just to the items that exist there in Microsoft Audit Collection Services. Notice here that there's this little warning that identifies that members of the security role won't automatically have permissions to new views added there in the folder. So if additional views are added, you'll later on have to go through this wizard one more time to add access for these particular views. This is obviously very different than the usual inheritance of privileges that you're used to thinking of, like with NTFS permissions. So this is very different in that they are directly assigned permissions on all these individual dashboards and views. So all of these I'll give access to my auditors group right down here and choose Next and Create to go about creating this new user role. For this gives them access to the information here inside the Ops Manager console and also there inside of the web console as well. But for these auditors, although having access to the information we just provided is kind of useful, it's really the reports that auditors are most commonly interested in. And so let's also create another user role here for reporting. This is our report operator right here, which is very different from what you saw just a second ago. As you'll see here, there aren't actually any configurations here once I create this new report operator role. Rather, what I need to do here is auditor reports as the user role name, and then adding in once again, this is my auditors group here, adding in that company/auditors group right there. When I choose Next here and create, this will now create that new auditor group. And what I need to do then, once I've created the group, is to take a look at the group properties here, and then take a look at the identity value right here. The creation of this role here in Ops Manager does nothing for actually providing access to the reports over in SSRS. I actually have to take a second step here and copy and paste this ID to the clipboard and then enter it into my SSRS console to then actually give access to the group that I just created. So let me copy this here, right there to the clipboard, and I'll bring up a copy then of the SSRS console right here. It is here in the second part of the configuration where things get just a bit more complicated, or perhaps tedious is the better word. I say that because the configuration, the permissions configuration we're about to do here, is a bit like how we've done file and folder permissions with NTFS in the past. If you ever had to configure a long tree, a very large tree of file and folder permissions, you've gone through the process of configuring the permissions at the top level and then having to more or less invert those permissions at levels beneath. That process is required here because the very first step in this process starts here under the home view, right over here, where we need to first enable access so that users can then see all the different folders that exist and the reports within. I will do that by adding in the group or user here and then punching in that 8870, that GUID that's associated with the group that we just created. For that group, again, I just pasted that there for the clipboard, but for that group, I need to give them at least browser and my reports access down here at a minimum. This is what's required at bare minimum for this phase of the game. If they have need to schedule reports or do some of the more advanced things, we can add in the content manager role here as well. But for our purposes, just to enable access to view the reports, that user will need browse and then my reports access here at the root. It's here where you can make the decision as to whether or not users should have access to all the reports in the tree or just limited reports in the tree. If it is just limited reports in the tree that you want them to have access to, the next step is to then break inheritance for all the other reports where you don't want them to have access. I won't go through that process, but I'll show you here that if I do manage on another report folder and choose security here, by hitting the customize security button, that will go about breaking the inheritance, which will then allow me to then remove the access right down here. If for some reason I wanted to revert back to inheritance, I could choose to use the same security as parent folder, and that would bring that back under the permissions inheritance that was there before. We're not going to do that. I think this user will probably have need to access more than just those ACS reports. But again, if you have need to do that, this is the process by which you would then make those available. There is actually one more further configuration that's specific to ACS reports. Here at this point, based off of just what we've done here so far, a user will be able to generate and run reports for everything else that's been configured here in these folders. But the audit reports go into a different database. And because of that, we have need to make a special configuration change there on the database itself so that the user can then read that information and then generate the reports here with SSRS. Let's continue this process by bringing up here the SQL Server Management Studio, where I need to make that small configuration change to grant them the access to read the information out of the ACS database. Here I'll direct this to my SQL Server. This is sql.company.pri. And then right here is my Operations Manager AC database here, which you'll notice if I look at the security for this database and the users, right here the security for this database as configured is based off of machine security. So there aren't really any users that have much in the way of access here to the database so far. In order to grant that necessary access, I'll start here under security, and under logins right here, create a new login that will be associated with that group that I just created over there in Ops Manager in the console. Let's start here under search and then change the location here to entire directory and then add in the abilities to look for groups. I still have that auditors group that I'm looking for, and if I check the names here, that will be the Active Directory group company/auditors that I now want to associate with this database. Specifically, the database access that is required is right here on the AC database. You'll need to have DB_data reader privileges on the database to then gather that data through the lens of the report that we've configured here. Once I do that, if I hit OK here and create that association, that now gives all the necessary permissions all the way through the thread here so that that user can now access those ACS reports in addition to everything else. Now, if you've done everything correctly, we should be able to log out as the G Shields user account and log in as the Donna Jones account and now see the results of our efforts. I am here again on the same machine. This is my desktop, but I am logged in as Donna Jones. Let's bring up the Operations Manager console and see what things now look like from Donna's perspective as opposed to from my perspective. We can see here under the monitoring view that we have our audit collection services view, we have our collector and our forwarder view, and then sub to that we have the different event and state views that are relevant for those collectors and forwarders. See, here are the events associated with ADT server and the state associated with the MGMT server. Here are his performance and performance data here that I could take a look at if I wanted to. Down here under forwarder, I could see, take a look, I don't have any events and I don't have any state view as well. I wanted to show you this slight failure here because as you go through creating these views and carving out who should be able to access what, sometimes you may need to adjust what the scope of the data will be for different users based off of what will be required here by the different views that are being generated. And this tends to be a bit of a guess and check process. If you are expecting there to be more information here and it's not, it's probably being removed or stripped out of the view by the scope that you configured there for that user. So again, mainly I showed you this as a bit of a failure to mainly illustrate that sometimes the defining of what those scopes will be might just be a little bit different or a bit broader than what you might expect for the different views you're making available to your users. Down here also you can see we don't have the administration or the authoring tabs down here at the bottom, But if I take a look at reporting, if you've done everything correctly, we should at this point see all the reports for which this user has permission. As you recall, I did not go through and lock down that whole permission structure away from visibility for this user. So the user will be able to see all the different reports that exist here. And that same user will also be able to run these reports and gather information that exists in the reports. Down here under audit reports are the audits that the audit reports that this user should also have access to view. And if we've done everything correctly, I should be able to pull up a report here and see that indeed some information does arrive. So let's say here for Sunday, if I punch in Company G Shields and run the report, I should get a successful report here that shows information about the logons for this particular user. So this is actually a good response here, letting me know that indeed I have all the permissions correctly assigned. If you get any error messages, those are probably related to permissions misconfigurations, and you might have to go back to either the SQL Server Management Studio or over into SSRS to adjust exactly how those permissions have been configured. As I said, in some cases, this is a bit of a guess and check here and trying to figure out exactly what needs to be configured. While we're here, I also want to spend some time talking about My Workspace, which is this area where users can then craft out just the couple of views that they're interested in so that they don't have to end up digging around through the very large or potentially very large tree that can exist here in the monitoring view. Down here is My Workspace, and My Workspace itself actually is empty whenever you first set up this configuration for this user. The way in which you set up My Workspace, or to populate it with the objects of interest to the user, is by simply right-clicking and choosing to add to My Workspace. Once I've done that, I can give it a name, and once I've done that also, I can create it in a different location. So if I have a different folder structure as the user, I can create my own separate folder structure that is of sense to me. Once I've done that, I'll hit OK down here, and it just shows up here in My Workspace. So this is just a way in which the users can go about actually customizing their views so that they don't really care about the views that are out there. They can limit themselves to just those that are of importance to them. Also, if users are looking for particular items, you can set up saved searches here as well that will help them to search for specific object types like alerts, events, monitors, object discoveries, and so on. So this could be handy as you start distributing more and more different views and objects to users so that they can actually just find out the kinds of information that they're looking for. Now, for some users, even just this full Operations Manager console experience may still just be a bit too heavyweight for their usage patterns, for how they're actually consuming this data. If you find users that are mostly just reading data and are not interacting by creating tasks or setting overrides on content, the full Operations Manager console and its need for an installation onto a machine may just be a bit too heavyweight for what they require. And even for yourself, if you're out in a location where you don't have a copy of the Operations Manager console, sometimes it's useful to just be able to read information without having to install it. And so here, let's go to https://mgmt.company.pri/operationsmanager and log in here with the D Jones account so that we can see their web console framed within the context of what's been permissioned out for them. Let me then add in their password here to take a look at how the console looks for this user D Jones. Right here under monitoring, we can see more or less the same content that we saw before. Here's our state view. Here are some performance views here as well. So just some basic information here that's designed to be read optimized if I just need to see a little bit about what's going on in this Ops Manager infrastructure. The My Workspace view here also is available. So if users want to add things into their My Workspace, they can do so here. As you can see, it's a little bit different than what you have in the console itself. But this is one way in which we can provide additional access to users framed again within the context of what's been permissioned to them. One thing you will notice is that in our installation here, the reporting pane right down here in the lower left is actually not visible, whereas it is visible there in the full Operations Manager console. And in fact, this actually highlights an omission that I should have realized as we were going through the initial build of this whole environment. Let me show you here something I've copied and pasted here from Microsoft's TechNet website that talks about why we're not actually seeing the reporting pane there in our web console. It says, quote, if you want to access published reports there via the web console, you must install the Ops Manager web console on the same computer as your Operations Manager reporting server. We did not do that. We installed it on MGMT as opposed to being on SQL. Remember also that your reporting server needs to be on top of that SQL Server reporting server instance. So as you can see here, we have some limitations. If I want to be able to provision out this web console with the reports to users, I do have to have all these different pieces, the SSRS piece, the reporting server piece, and the web console piece all being on the same system. Obviously, we didn't do that here, so we can't see it, but I just wanted to highlight this as you're going through the further configuration of your environment if you do plan on making those reports available to users through a web console interface. Switching gears then, for the last task in this module, let's talk a bit about the run as accounts and the profiles associated with those run as accounts that are handy to be that kind of middleman between a user and an action that user needs to accomplish. I've talked already about how in certain circumstances you may have a low privileged user that needs to accomplish a high privileged task on a particular machine, but you don't want to give that user full administrator rights. When that's the case, you may need to set up what is termed here an action account, or really just a run as account, in order to be able to allow that user to complete that task, or to complete a predefined task, I should say, here inside of the Ops Manager console. I'll start here by taking a look at the accounts right here, where you can see some of the accounts that we've configured here already. This is the Management Server Action Account, OMAA, which is the default account by which all the rules are run there on each agent. There is also a built-in system account that can be also used as an action account. We created that SNMP community string back a couple of modules ago when we were talking about the configuration of network monitoring. And we have some other action accounts here for our data warehouse, for the report deployment, our local system Windows account, and a network service Windows account as well. I can create new accounts if I should so choose by simply choosing to create a new run as account right here. These new run as accounts can be used for various purposes. Let's say I have a Windows account here. I don't know, for this account, I'll call it do administrative things. And if I choose next down here, I can provide credentials here for the account. So I don't know, I'll cheat here and use my own account, although usually you'll want to use a specially configured service account that either has the requirement for password resets disabled or is set up as a special kind of service account, a group managed service account there in Windows. Again, I'll just use G Shields here just so we can get through the next page of the wizard, but these are typically service accounts on which you have the permissions assigned. If I punch this in and manage to type in the password correctly both times, this will take us then to the next page here in the wizard. If I choose next, this is the distribution security options here for this run as account. You can either manually select which computers to which the credentials will be supplied, or you can distribute those credentials automatically to any managed computer. Depending on how you plan on using this, you'll probably want to choose the more secure option down here to then manually select which computers on which the credentials will be distributed. If I create this action account then and choose closed, I will then need to associate the run as account with an appropriate profile for defining what it should be able to do. Let me choose close down here and show you the profiles. Many of these profiles have been configured automatically for you right out of the box. And as you'll find for many of them, if we click into the wizard here, you'll find that for many of them, the actual account has not been associated here. There really is no run as account that's been configured for this particular use. In those circumstances where no run as account has been assigned to a profile, the Management Server Action account will be the default account to be used for actually performing the action. So don't worry if you don't see anything here, or perhaps replace this with accounts that you do want to be used as run as accounts if you want to separate out these activities from that MSAA account, that Management Server Action account. Let me hit cancel here and actually create a new profile that we can use for associating with our new run as account that we configured just a second ago. I will choose to create a new run as profile here, and for this profile we'll call it do administrative things here, and then store this here in the default management pack, so right here. This default management pack, we'll talk more about why we're putting it here in the course coming up, but this is just a location where this run as profile gets stored here should I need to remove it then later on. I will choose next here and define which run as account is associated here with the profile. For that, we'll do the do administrative things run as account and allow this to then be scoped to either all targeted objects or specific classes, groups, or objects. Obviously, later on, when we go through actually rolling this into production, the creation of the run as account is probably one of the last things that you do after you've gone through defining what the task will be or what the action that needs to be performed then on those client machines. If you've defined them, well, then here in this selection is where you define exactly which object on which this account will be available for. It's here where you define exactly what kind of object, what kind of task or what have you, that this account will have the privileges to be able to perform. And really, this is the meat and potatoes here of really locking down exactly what this account should be able to perform. I'll hit cancel here and we'll choose all targeted objects, although again, this is really not a great idea for in production. And if I finish this and choose create, this now creates this run as profile and associates it with the account that we just configured. Later on, as we get into the further authoring of additional overrides and tasks and what have you, there in the course coming up, it's there with the authoring of tasks and other items. We'll have these run as profiles and accounts really become more relevant in their actual execution. Once we've created this account, then we can choose then to define exactly where this account should go. So onto which computers should this account actually be provisioned. If I wanted to, I could pick which computers here using the computer search, but for now, because we're not actually going to use this in any kind of production sense, we'll just skip through this page of the wizard here. I'll choose close to complete the wizard. It is worth mentioning here that although we are a bit glossing over the use of these run as accounts, at least as they're related to actually constraining them in a fully functioning production environment, I think it's worth mentioning here that under the monitoring view, when you start looking at the different objects that exist in your infrastructure and the tasks that are associated with those objects, like for example here under distributed inventory, when you start looking at the tasks here, these tasks, in addition to the constraints on the run as accounts, these tasks will be constrained to specific objects themselves. And so here under SQL.company.pri, because of the way the view is constructed here, I'm only allowed to perform certain tasks here because of how that management pack and how the view in that MP have been authored. If I go to a different location down here, so if I go to the event view here, or perhaps the state view here for mgmt.company.pri, there will be, well, some same tasks here, but ostensibly some different tasks depending on what has been configured there for these particular views. Let me pick another one down here for Microsoft Windows Server, and then Windows Server Operating System State, or perhaps Windows Server State here. It's there where, again, we can see a list of Windows computer tasks right down here that they themselves are limited to just specifically the kinds of things that a person would be doing if they have access to this area, this object here in the tree. So later on, as we start getting into the authoring of tasks and other objects there in the authoring pane, this will make more sense in terms of limiting things both from what is available there in the view, as well as which run as accounts will be able to perform those tasks once all this gets integrated together. So actually quite a bit of content here for a module that might seem not all that interesting. What have we talked about in this module? We've gone through the users and also the user roles that make up actually disseminating out permissions for our Ops Manager infrastructure. We talked first about the different kinds of user role profiles, the 5 major categories of starting points for the creation of any user role, and then the association of actual Active Directory human beings. From there, we went into the configuration of user roles, which is a single-step process in most circumstances, except in that one circumstance where I'm working with reports. We then also went through the second half, at least for reports, of configuration there in SSRS, so that our users would have access to the views as well as the reports they require. From there, we took a look at how that actually looks for the user's perspective when they log into the operations console, as well as there in the web console. And then from that user's perspective, how they can then constrain down the reports you've given them to just those that are important in their My Workspace view. We took a look there at the web console and the similarities and the differences between what you get there in the operations console, and concluded with a very quick look there at the run as accounts and profiles, really just sort of introducing this topic so that we're prepared for it as we get into the authoring task in the course coming up. Coming up next, we have the last of our topics here in this course on installing and the initial configuration of Operations Manager. That last topic is on the configurations of backups and disaster recovery considerations for this Ops Manager infrastructure. In the next module, we'll talk about just the things you need to back up, as well as some of the ways in which you can ease that recovery process should you lose a single server all the way through an entire site. That conversation on the configuration of backups and disaster recovery considerations is the topic for our next module coming up. We end as we began this course with just a soussault of Microsoft PowerPoint in some of the backups and disaster recovery topics that you should at least consider as you go through the production implementation of this Ops Manager infrastructure. This conversation here won't dig much at all into the click-by-click for actually doing backups and setting up disaster recovery. Your tool, whatever backup solution you have, whatever disaster recovery solutions you have in place already, are really going to define exactly what kind of product you use to complete the backup. So here I want to focus our attentions on just some of the high-level practices, best practices in setting up backups, and then preparing, if you should so choose, for implementing any kind of disaster recovery architecture. Here in this module, the last of this course on implementing and configuring Operations Manager, let's talk a bit about just some of the backup and recovery schedules mostly that you need to think of, and also which databases you really should then back up. These days, the backing up of SQL Server databases is generally quite a bit easier than it was in days of the past. In the old days, many of us had to go through a separate backup process to extract the database into a file-based format and then back up that no longer active database there in a file through whatever tool we were using. Most of us these days are using a backup solution that supports the online backup of SQL Server databases, most commonly through VSS or other approaches. And so because of that, I really just want to focus here on what the schedule is that Microsoft recommends for setting up your backups. There is one additional topic here in terms of the unsealed management packs. So these are ones that we don't download from Microsoft, but rather those that include the special configurations, the other overrides that we haven't yet quite configured, but are necessary if we want to be able to recover those overrides into a new and recovered infrastructure. The process to export management packs is just a couple of clicks there in the interface, but for the most part, it is a couple of clicks. And so it's important here to recognize that whether you drift into the PowerShell or whether you do it from the Ops Manager console, every so often it's a good idea to export out your unsealed management packs, again, those that contain your special configurations, so that you can bring them back into your infrastructure if you have a disaster you need to recover. We'll talk also about the steps in recovering a management server, the core here of our Ops Manager infrastructure, as well as just some of the disaster recovery configurations that if you do go down that road, you might just think about. We're not going to go into very much detail here, but rather just kick off the idea that disaster recovery configurations are possible if you're willing to pay for the expense. Microsoft offers a suggested backup and recovery schedule for the different databases that contain the data in your Ops Manager infrastructure. And as you can see here, I've got 6 of the major databases that already exist here in our infrastructure. Let's talk about how we might want to set up our backup schedule then for each of these databases. The database that includes arguably the most important content is your operational database. That content is all the monitoring information, all of the alerts, and everything that makes up our experience there in working with the Ops Manager console. And so Microsoft's recommendation here is a weekly full backup with daily incrementals, really the same kind of backup that you're probably doing for all the important data that exists there in your environment. This is, as I said, the most important information because it is the most recent and relevant for the behaviors going on today in an environment. And it's for that reason that the other data, the longer term data in your data warehouse database, has a slightly different backup schedule with monthly fulls and weekly incrementals. The content in this database is important, obviously, but the content probably doesn't get accessed as much, at least in the everyday troubleshooting of system behaviors, as what's in your operational database. So if you find yourself needing more, you may just dial this back a bit to weekly and daily, but this is Microsoft's recommendation here in terms of monthly fulls and weekly incrementals. When we create reports, anytime we're doing any report definition creation there on a reporting server, it's then and only then that those report definitions need a further backup. Microsoft recommends a full backup of your reporting server after performing any significant changes to report definitions. If you find yourself creating new reports on a more regular basis, you may need to then back up those report definitions on your reporting server and its database more often than just every so often. Your ACS database, if you are using one, obviously has important information there for your auditors. It's important also if you have a security event. But since those events don't tend to happen all that often, for the most part, just gathering this information in a more archival approach is probably okay for most organizations. Obviously, if you're in a high security environment where you have to have this information, you might back this off to weeklies and dailies as opposed to monthlies and weeklies. But this is Microsoft's recommendation here for the content in your average prototypical ACS database. Also, for these databases, there are a pair of databases, system databases there on your SQL Server that require attention. Your master database will need to be backed up after any significant changes to the actual SQL Server logins or any other security configurations. And this is Microsoft's quote here for incrementals per your IT policy. The master database tends to be relatively small anyway, and so just putting it into your regular round of backups is not really going to cost you all that much. The same is true here with your MSDB database. Microsoft's recommendation is to do a full backup after any configuration or reconfiguration of SCOM's database features, and then an incremental after any significant changes to the SQL Server agent jobs that SCOM is performing. As with the master database, these are very important. These system databases are very important, and they're not very large. And so the reality is if you just put them on your regular capture of system databases for all SQL servers, because of their very small size, they're probably not going to impact the total amount of time it takes to get this content backed up. One special activity that has nothing to do with backing up of databases has to do with our management packs, and specifically the unsealed management packs that exist here in the infrastructure. These unsealed management packs are not the ones we download from Microsoft or from our third parties or anywhere where we're trying to integrate in some third-party application or solution here into Ops Manager. Rather, the unsealed management packs are those that contain our own private configurations, the overrides, the run as accounts, all the stuff that we use to tune this reporting on behaviors for our particular data center here. If I take a look at the management packs right down here, I'm looking here under installed management packs where I can see all of those that exist here right out of the box. I know we haven't implemented any management packs here from Microsoft.com just yet, but these are the ones that come through the initial installation of Operations Manager. You can see that these MPs include quite a bit of knowledge. We are already monitoring certain items here for the servers we've connected to. In addition to those that are sealed, however, we also have a set of management packs that we consider to be unsealed. It is these unsealed management packs that are the storage location for the different monitors and rules and overrides and run as accounts that we will later then be creating. All of this is a topic, the customization of all these things is a topic for the course coming up. That said, though, it's the unsealed management packs that are arguably more important because these are the ones that contain our own private configuration and can't be re-downloaded from Microsoft.com. For that reason, it's generally a good idea to export out these management packs from time to time. That process is relatively simple. You just right-click and choose to export out the management pack to a location. I show you this not so much because it's difficult, it is not, but that the exporting of these unsealed management packs is a very good idea for you to do after you've gone through a period of substantial change to any overrides or any other tuning effects that you may have applied. Once you've made those changes, export out the management pack and put it into a nice location where it can be stored for later recovery. The other management packs, those that you've downloaded from Microsoft or from a third-party vendor, these it's generally a good idea to have in a location where you can gather them once again. We will go through that process of then downloading and storing those MPs here locally before uploading it into our operations console as an early task in the course coming up. But for now, as I mentioned, as part of this whole backup and recovery conversation, just might want to go through here and take a look at your MPs and make sure that they're successfully exported from time to time as you make major changes. The process to recover a database using SQL Server is the topic for an entirely different course here in the Pluralsight catalog. So we won't talk really at all about how you go about recovering a database there with SQL Server. I'll leave that to another author elsewhere in the catalog. But here for our management server, I want to talk a bit about just the steps that are required to recover a management server. So how you actually get that management server back online. There are really maybe one or two gotchas here, important points that you should be prepared for if you do have to recover a management server. The first of these is really the most important and all the configurations that you have to think about, and that is build a new management server that uses the same name as the management server you just lost. If you use the same computer name as the old management server, the one that just failed, it greatly simplifies. In fact, really allows this whole recovery to occur. All those relationships, all those links there in the database are oriented towards that same name, And so recovering the database and then using that server with the same name makes much more easy the process of recovering that failed management server. Once you've done that, or really in parallel with building that new server, your next step is to restore your operational database and data warehouse database. It's worth mentioning here that these two are what's minimally necessary to get your Ops Manager infrastructure online, although the process to recover the other databases, like your reporting server and ACS database, are things that can occur more or less simultaneously with this restoration. Once the databases are in place, your next step is to install your management server there onto that machine with the same name using the recover parameter, that's /recover there. And it's worth mentioning here that in order to do a recovery, you do have to do this process then from the command line, which requires you not only to know the /recover parameter, but then all the other parameters that are required to do a command line and silent installation of a management server. I have them all listed right here, but the only one that's different from a typical installation of a management server is the one right up here at the top, that /recover parameter. Everything else that you see here on the screen is just what's required to then build a new management server, and so will be equivalent to the process you would go through if you did install your management server there silently from the command prompt. Once that process is complete, you really have the rest of the cleanup activities to go through, which include that process of recreating your run as accounts. The run as accounts will not necessarily be automatically created for you, and so one of the very first steps you'll need to go through is there in the console, actually going through the recreation of those run as accounts for all the different activities that you may have configured before. For this reason, it may be a good idea for you to document which run as accounts correlate then with which Active Directory user accounts that you've associated them with, or in the case of other network configurations or other third-party applications, any other kind of accounts that you're using there as a run as account. Not listed here are the other activities like recovering your reporting server. They have very similar processes to what we see here, and obviously validating that your clients are then now redirecting to this new server, which should have the same name and then thus not actually break that connection from your clients here to your new server. The good news is that while the recovery of a management server can seem like a painful activity, and in fact recovering any server is always a painful activity, because of the way that Ops Manager stores its configurations there in the database, as long as you have a good recovery of that database, for the most part you should find yourself back up and into operations after these relatively limited extra steps that are required. Now, backup and recovery are one thing, and disaster recovery is yet another. I do want to talk a bit about some of the disaster recovery options that are commonly seen out in the wild when people are implementing Ops Manager infrastructures. But I want to start by framing this whole disaster recovery conversation with a quote that you see here on the screen. I grabbed this actually from Microsoft's actual DR design document there on TechNet, or really in docs.microsoft.com. It says, quote, "In many cases, the cost to enable multi-site disaster recovery far outweighs the value of the data." This could be the case, honestly, with a lot of these different System Center tools. The data that a System Center tool like Ops Manager intends to gather tends to be more recent data, more recently relevant data at least. If you think about the alerts and the monitors and all the different views that you're seeing when you do look at that operations console, for the most part, you're interested in what's going on right now. There is obviously some need there for historical data, but because of this focus on more recent data and how things are going on in the environment right now, the actual creation of a disaster recovery environment many times is just far more work than simply redeploying an entirely new Ops Manager infrastructure. If you have good backups and recovery, you can bring back all those monitors and rules and custom management packs and overrides back into a replacement system after a day or two of extra effort. That said, though, there is the ability to create then some disaster recovery configurations. On one side, you have one that is higher cost and higher complexity, and on the other side, you have one that is a lower cost, lower complexity, which is really more like a backup and recovery in a different site configuration than a true disaster recovery implementation. On the left-hand side, for higher cost and higher complexity, it is possible to deploy a duplicate management group to a secondary data center or even up into the cloud that has been similarly scaled and configured to the primary management group. So what we're saying here is effectively you are creating an identical Ops Manager infrastructure in that secondary location that has all the servers and all the components and the entire configuration mirrored from your primary implementation in your primary data center. The way in which this works is that you configure your agents to then report to both management groups in a multi-homed configuration. This then has each agent sending its information to both management groups more or less at the same time. Obviously, this means a duplication of data. This means having a duplication of an entire infrastructure, but then the failover after the loss of an entire site is more or less automatic because clients will simply repoint themselves to that secondary location, or really they don't even have to repoint themselves. They're already pointed to that secondary location. So this is the higher cost and higher complexity configuration because you do have to have an entire mirrored second copy of the Ops Manager infrastructure for this to work. On the lower cost and lower complexity side, there are some options in terms of how you might implement this configuration. This approach involves deploying servers into a secondary data center or into the cloud in a cold standby configuration. If you're using a cloud like Microsoft Azure, you could spin up new virtual machines when the disaster happens and begin that process of recovering them. These servers are not going to participate in the management group until any recovery action needs to be performed. So whether it's physical servers in a secondary location or cloud-based servers, they're not actually doing anything really until that disaster occurs in your primary site. Optionally, if you want to decrease your RPO and RTO, one way in which you can do that is to have a certain number of servers, just your SQL servers, actively participating with the primary site. For this, you could configure a SQL always-on availability group to provide database replication for the database content there in your primary site. So you have a couple of additional options here that are lower cost and lower complexity. There's still a recovery involved, installing that software and bringing it online after the disaster occurs. But again, because of the recency of the data here, just the way Operations Manager is designed to work, for most situations where a need for immediate failover is not required, these different lower cost and lower complexity configurations may just suffice, even if you just have the abilities to spin up new virtual machines in Azure as a way to implement disaster recovery for your Operations Manager environment. To be perfectly frank, I've not actually seen a disaster recovery implementation for Ops Manager out in the wild. I have seen some backup and recovery situations, although never a full mirrored solution where we have instant failover from primary site to backup. That said, though, the increasing primacy of Microsoft Azure as an alternative site kind of brings to light some of these not quite as immediate failover options for setting up disaster recovery should you have a failure. It's worth exploring the abilities to create new virtual machines and then move your Ops Manager infrastructure there into the cloud as an option for where you might then relocate your monitoring if you do have a problem. It's worth mentioning also that the monitoring of those Azure-based resources is in fact one of the topics for the course not coming up, but the one after that. So if Azure is the direction you're heading, stay tuned because we're eventually going to get into monitoring those resources. For now, though, what have we talked about in this module? We've gone through the backup recovery and disaster recovery, just items you need to think about as you begin rolling Ops Manager into production. We talked about backup and recovery, just the schedule really for how you might back up Ops Manager's databases. We looked there at the exporting of our management packs, so actually how you get those unsealed management packs then into the physical world where they can be backed up. We talked about recovering a management server and really that one parameter you need to be prepared for. And then take a look there at some of the configurations for disaster recovery, all the way from an instant failover to an eventual failover after that disaster occurs. Coming up next, we have an entirely new course where we start to really dig in to the monitoring configurations and the authoring of monitoring there inside the infrastructure we've built here so far. In that next course, we'll talk about the different ways in which you can configure things like monitors and rules and tasks. We'll talk about overrides and how you can tune existing management packs so that it better fits within the behaviors of your data center and its services. We'll start building our own distributed applications, focusing first on this little RDS infrastructure we've been toying with here so far. We'll look at things like service level agreements and objectives, providing some metrics for understanding the true uptime for all the services that make up a particular application, and also talk about agentless exception monitoring, a way in which we can learn just a bit more about the exceptions, the blue screens, the other major events that happen on our servers and desktops. That conversation on monitoring Windows Server 2016 with our Ops Manager infrastructure is the topic for our next course coming up.